They say true talent reveals itself not in moments of triumph, but in the darkest hours when everything hangs by a thread. For William "Will" Hawthorne, that moment came on a scorching afternoon in Rattlesnake Valley when the shadow of greed fell across his family's legacy like a hangman's noose. This is the story of how a group of ruthless men learned, far too late, that they'd threatened the wrong rancher's son, a quiet young man whose steady hands and sharp eyes masked a gift that could only be measured in gun smoke and brass. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The merciless Arizona sun beat down on Shadow Creek Ranch, casting harsh shadows across weathered fence posts and sun-bleached buildings. Will Hawthorne sat motionless on the front porch of his father's house, his calloused hands moving with practiced precision over each part of a beautifully maintained Winchester rifle. At just 19, his hands betrayed an intimacy with firearms that went far beyond mere familiarity. Each movement spoke of countless hours spent understanding not just the mechanics of shooting, but the pure mathematics of it. Old Manuel Ramirez, who'd worked the ranch since before Will was born, often said the boy had been born with a rifle in his hands instead of a silver spoon. Those who knew the Hawthorne family understood there was more truth to that statement than most realized. James Hawthorne, Will's father, had once been the most celebrated marksman in 3 territories, a man whose exhibitions of precision shooting had drawn crowds from as far as San Francisco and St. Louis. But that was before the accident at the Carson City exhibition, before the bullet that shattered not just James Hawthorne's right shoulder, but his entire world, before the laudanum and whiskey became his constant companions, leaving his son to shoulder burdens no young man should have to bear. The ranch hands gave the porch a wide berth when Will was working on his guns, which had become a daily ritual, since the Scorpion Gang had started making trouble in Rattlesnake Valley. They'd already torched the Martinez spread 10 miles south, and Old Man Peterson's place had mysteriously burned to the ground after he refused to sell to the mining interests moving into the territory. But what unsettled the hands most wasn't Will's dedication to maintaining his firearms. It was the way he would sometimes pause in his work, raise his hands as if holding an invisible gun, and track the flight of hawks across the sky with those unnaturally steady fingers, his eyes calculating distances that would make even seasoned marksmen hesitate. Maria Ortiz, who ran the general store in nearby Copper Springs, still talked about the day she'd seen young Will out hunting. She'd been gathering herbs on the ridge above Sidewinder Creek when she spotted him tracking a buck. The shot he made was impossible, or should have been. The deer was running full tilt nearly a half-mile out when Will's rifle cracked once. The buck dropped so clean, so precise, it was as if lightning had struck it from above. Maria never mentioned what she saw to anyone but her husband, and when the Scorpion Gang started their campaign of terror through the valley, she found herself watching the quiet Hawthorne boy with new eyes. None of the ranch hands had ever seen Will shoot. Not really. There were rumors, of course, whispered stories about impossible shots made while hunting, about bottles shattered at distances that strained belief. But Will never participated in the hands shooting contests, never rose to their good-natured taunts about proving himself. He just kept to his daily routine, splitting his time between ranch work and caring for his father, those quiet hands never far from a holster. The late morning sun had baked the porch boards to a temperature that would scorch bare feet, but Will hadn't moved for over an hour. His father was having one of his better days, actually coming down for breakfast and managing to hold a conversation about the ranch's declining cattle prices. These moments of clarity were becoming rarer, and Will treasured each one, even when they brought painful reminders of the man his father used to be. This morning James had even mentioned the old days, speaking of trick shots and exhibition tours with a spark of his former enthusiasm. "Your mother," he'd said, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he held his coffee cup. "She always said you had my eyes when you were born. But it wasn't just the color, boy. It was the way you looked at things. Like you were measuring every distance, calculating every angle." He'd fallen silent then, lost in memories of his late wife, but the words had stirred something in Will, a recognition of a truth he'd always known but never fully acknowledged. The sound of approaching horses drew Will's attention from his work. Through the heat-rippled air, he could make out 5 riders approaching the ranch at a leisurely pace, their intentions written in the way they carried themselves. The lead. Ryder sat on his horse like a man who preferred intimidation to conversation, his black duster catching the hot wind. Behind him, his companions spread out slightly, a classic gunfighter's approach that spoke of experience and ill intent. The Scorpion Gang had finally decided to pay the Hawthorns a visit, unaware they were about to learn why some talents are best left undiscovered. Will's hands never paused in their methodical cleaning of the Winchester, but his eyes, those shooter's eyes his father had mentioned, had already noted distances, angles, and the subtle way the wind bent the tall grass near the corral. In the back of his mind, he could hear his father's voice from years ago, before the accident. "Son, it's not about being the fastest or the meanest. It's about seeing what others can't. About understanding the dance before the music starts." As the riders drew closer, Will reassembled the rifle with a speed and precision that would have made a gunsmith jealous. Every piece clicked into place with the certainty of destiny, each sound a note in a symphony that was about to reach its crescendo. The Scorpion Gang was about to discover that some legacies don't die. They just wait for the right moment to reveal themselves. Sheriff. Marcus Kane sat in his office in Copper Springs, studying the wanted posters that had been piling up on his desk with growing concern. The Scorpion Gang's reputation had spread like wildfire across 3 territories, leaving a trail of burned homesteads and broken families in their wake. Marcus had known James Hawthorne in the old days, before the accident that shattered more than just his shooting arm. He'd watched young Will grow up, notice things that others missed, the way the boy's eyes tracked movement, how his hands always seemed to know exactly where they needed to be. "More coffee, Sheriff." Elena Rodriguez, the owner of the Silver Spur Cafe across the street, stood in his doorway with a steaming pot. Her family had run the restaurant for 2 generations, weathering the prejudices of frontier life through a combination of exceptional cooking and quiet dignity. "Thanks, Elena." Marcus pushed his cup toward her. "Just thinking about the Hawthorne boy. Saw him in town yesterday, buying ammunition at Maria's store. Something about him reminded me of his father, back before—" He trailed off, remembering. "The exhibition where it had all gone wrong. Tragic business," Elena nodded, filling his cup. "But that boy's got steel in his spine. Comes in every Sunday after church, orders the same meal his father used to. Always exact change, always a kind word." She hesitated. "Though lately, I've noticed something different about him. The way he's always facing the door, always aware, like he's expecting trouble." Marcus had noticed too. The whole valley had changed since the Scorpion Gang arrived, bringing with them promises of progress wrapped in threats of violence. The mining company was coming, they said, and those who didn't sell would burn. But the Hawthorne's spread was different. It sat on the only viable pass through the mountain ridge, making it the key to controlling the entire valley. Old Manuel chose that moment to burst through the office door, his weathered face flushed with urgency. "Sheriff, riders headed for Hawthorne's place, Snake-Eye Jackson himself leading them." Marcus felt his blood run cold. Snake-Eye Jackson was the Scorpion Gang's enforcer, a man who'd earned his nickname through deeds that decent folks wouldn't discuss in daylight. If he was personally calling on the Hawthorne ranch, how many? Marcus was already strapping on. His gun belt. 5 that I saw. Manuel's voice carried the weight of worry. But Sheriff, it's not Jackson I'm worried about. It's Will. Elena's eyes widened. Surely they wouldn't. No, Manuel cut her off. It's what might happen to them. There's something you both need to know about Will Hawthorne, something I saw last month that I haven't told another soul. Marcus paused in checking his ammunition. He'd known Manuel for 20 years, knew him as a man who measured his words carefully. It was dawn, and I was checking the north pasture fence, Manuel began, his voice low. Saw Will up on Eagle's Ridge, practicing with his father's old Winchester. Sheriff, I've watched exhibition shooters from San Francisco to St. Louis, but I've never... He shook his head. 8 bottles thrown in the air at once. 8 shots so fast they sounded like one. Every bottle was destroyed before a single piece hit the ground. Martha crossed herself, a habit left over from her Catholic schooling. Mary, Mother of Mercy... That's not all, Manuel continued. When he was done, he just stood there, reloading, like he was in no hurry at all. Then he looked right at where I was hiding, must have known I was there the whole time, just nodded once and walked away. Never show off like that again. Marcus absorbed this information, pieces falling into place, the way James Hawthorne had been so insistent on teaching his son before the accident, the quiet way Will carried himself, the slight bulge under his coat that wasn't quite hidden enough, to be a concealed weapon but wasn't meant to be. Manuel, Marcus asked carefully, you're sure about what you saw? Sheriff, Manuel's voice was heavy with certainty. I've been around guns my whole life. What that boy can do, it ain't natural. And if Snake Eye pushes him... He left the thought unfinished. Marcus made his decision. Elena, send word to Deputy Collins. Have him ready the horses. Manuel, you're with me. He checked his watch, an old habit from his days as a territorial marshal. With luck, we can get there before... A single gunshot echoed across the valley, sharp and clear in the morning air. Then another, and another, and another. The 3 of them stood frozen, counting the reports that rolled across the landscape, like thunder. When they stopped, Elena spoke first, her voice barely a whisper. Heaven help them. No, Marcus said grimly, heading for the door. Heaven help anyone who pushed Will Hawthorne into proving he's his father's son. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The 5 riders pulled up 30 yards from the porch, their horses' hooves kicking. Up dusk that danced in the morning light. Snake Eye Jackson sat astride his black stallion like a dark prophecy, his duster catching the wind as he surveyed the weathered ranch house. The man's reputation had been built on violence, but it was his eyes that told the true story, cold and calculating, like a rattler sizing up its prey. His namesake left eye, clouded and dead from an old knife fight, seemed to reflect the darkness within, this the Hawthorne place. Jackson's voice carried across the yard, though he knew damn well whose land he was on. His 4 companions, hard-looking, men with matching gun rigs, spread out slightly, their hands hovering near their holsters. Will didn't move from his spot on the porch, the Winchester resting casually in his lap. Inside the house, he could hear his father stirring, likely drawn by the sound of visitors. You know it is, Mr. Jackson. A flicker of surprise crossed Jackson's face at being recognized, followed by a cruel smile. Well, now it seems my reputation precedes me. That'll make this conversation shorter. He shifted in his saddle, deliberately letting his duster fall back to reveal the paired Colts at his hips. Got a business proposition for your daddy. Why don't you run inside and fetch him? My father's indisposed. Will's voice remained steady, his eyes taking in every detail of the scene before him. The way Jackson's right gun belt was worn slightly lower than his left, how the man on the right favored his left leg. Probably, from an old injury, the nervous energy in the 3rd rider, trigger finger tapping against his saddle horn. But I speak for the ranch now." A laugh rippled through Jackson's men, but their leader's expression darkened. "Boy, this ain't the kind of conversation children should be having. Mining companies coming through this pass, whether your daddy likes it or not. We're here to offer fair compensation before things get complicated." As if to emphasize Jackson's words, the rider with the nervous trigger finger drew his rifle from its scabbard, letting it rest casually across his saddle. The movement was meant to intimidate, but Will had already calculated the man's draw speed, factoring in the awkward angle and the morning sun that would be in his eyes. "This land's not for sale." Will's words carried the weight of finality. "Never has been, never will be. My father built this ranch with his own hands, and I aim to keep it in the family." Jackson's smile vanished like morning dew under a harsh sun. "Maybe you didn't hear about what happened to the Martinez place last week, or old man Peterson's spread the week before that. Terrible accidents, fire taking everything, no survivors to tell the tale." Inside the house, Will heard his father's bed creak, followed by the familiar sound of the old man's unsteady footsteps. His time was running out. He needed to end this before his father walked into danger. "I heard." Will's hand remained relaxed on the Winchester. "Also heard about 4 riders who didn't make it back from the Peterson place. Bodies never found, but their horses turned up in Copper Springs, saddles empty and clean as Sunday morning." The temperature seemed to drop despite the morning heat. Jackson's men exchanged glances, but their leader's face had gone still as stone. Those missing riders hadn't been mentioned in any official reports, and the story had been kept quiet to avoid panic. "The fact that this boy knew about it, that's a threat, son." Jackson's voice had lost its fake friendliness, replaced by something cold and deadly. "No, sir. Just telling stories." Will's eyes never left Jackson's face, though he was acutely aware of the other men's positions, the angles between them, the way the wind would affect any shots beyond 20 yards. "Like the story about how my father used to be the finest exhibition shooter west of the Mississippi. Could hit a dime at 50 paces, they say. Put 8 bullets through the same hole at 25 yards. "Used to be," Jackson sneered. "Everyone knows. James Hawthorne's nothing but a broken-down drunk now after that accident ruined his shooting arm. Shame about that exhibition in Carson City. Heard he hasn't touched a gun since." Will's finger twitched almost imperceptibly at the mention of Carson City, but his voice remained calm. "Think about talents like that, Mr. Jackson. Sometimes they run in the family." The significance of his words didn't register immediately, but when it did, Jackson's face twisted with understanding. His right hand dropped toward his gun, fast as a striking snake, but Will was already moving. The Winchester seemed to materialize in firing position, as if conjured by magic rather than raised. His first shot took Jackson's hat off, the second knocked the rifle from his nervous companion's hands, and the third disarmed the man with the limp. All 3 shots came so fast, they sounded like a single report echoing across the yard. Jackson froze, his gun barely cleared of leather, as Will's 4th shot put a neat hole through his duster right between the 2nd and 3rd button, a warning so precise it could only have been intentional. "That's 4, Will said quietly, the Winchester unwavering. "I've got more rounds, and my father always said to save something for an encore." The morning breeze carried the smell of gun smoke across the yard, mixing with the dust kicked up by the horses. Jackson's men sat rigid in their saddles, their eyes wide with the realization that they'd walked into something they didn't understand. "They said Hawthorne's boy was simple," Jackson spoke through clenched teeth, his hand still hovering near his half-drawn gun. "Said you barely talked, never caused trouble." "Don't much like trouble," Will agreed. "I don't much like showing off, either, but I like threats to my family even less." His eyes hardened. "Now, the way I see it, you've got 2 choices. Ride out of here, tell your mining friends this land's not for sale, and we all get to enjoy this beautiful morning. Or—" He left the alternative unspoken, but his meaning was clear. Jackson's face worked through a series of emotions: rage, fear, calculation, and finally, a grudging respect. "You think this is over, boy?" Jackson slowly moved his hand away from his gun. "One lucky showing doesn't make you a gunfighter. Men are going to hear about this, going to want to test themselves against Hawthorne's Prodigy son, and some of them won't be as patient as me." "Maybe so." Will's aim didn't waver. "But you won't be one of them, will you, Mr. Jackson? Because you've seen what I can do when I'm being polite. Might not want to find out what happens if someone pushes me into being rude." The sound of approaching horses came from the direction of town. Sheriff Kane and his posse, no doubt, though they were too late to matter now. Jackson recognized the sound too, his expression turning calculating. "Mount up," he ordered his men, turning his horse with exaggerated care. Boys made his choice. The mining company can find another route. But as he guided his stallion around, he fixed Will with a look that promised this wasn't over. "Impressive show, son. Real impressive. But remember, every target eventually runs out of luck." Will watched them ride away, the Winchester still ready in his hands. Only when they disappeared into the heat haze did he finally lower the weapon, his hands shaking slightly as the tension bled out of him. Behind him, the screen door creaked open. "Will?" His father's voice was clearer than it had been in months. "I heard shots. Just some salesman, Pa." Will carefully set the Winchester aside. "They weren't buying what we were selling." James Hawthorne stood in the doorway, his damaged arm held close to his chest, but his eyes were sharp with understanding. "4 shots," he said quietly. "Fast as lightning, clean as morning dew, just like I taught you." "Just like you taught me," Will agreed, turning to face his father. For a moment they looked at each other, the broken champion and his prodigy son, and something passed between them that needed no words. The approaching riders were closer now, their hoofbeats mixing with the sound of the wind through the grass. Will knew this was just the beginning. Jackson was right. Word would spread, challenges would come. The quiet life he'd built was over, shattered like a bottle under a perfect shot. But looking at his father, seeing the pride and worry warring in the old man's eyes, Will knew he'd make the same choice again. Some talents couldn't stay hidden forever, and some legacies were worth the price they demanded. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last shadows on the porch as father and son waited for the sheriff to arrive. In the distance, dust rose from Jackson's retreat, carrying with it the last traces of Will's anonymity. The boy who'd hidden his gift was gone, replaced by something both more and less than what he'd been. The legend of the Hawthorne name was about to be reborn, one perfect shot at a time. Sheriff Marcus Kane arrived at the Hawthorne Ranch to find Will and his father sitting on the porch like it was any other morning, though the gun smoke hanging in the air told a different story. 4 brass cartridge cases lay in the dust of the yard, each one placed with surgical precision where they'd fallen, the kind of detail that spoke volumes to a man who knew what to look for. "Quite a show you put on," Marcus said, dismounting alongside Manuel Ramirez. "Words already spreading in town. Elena's place is buzzing with talk about how Hawthorne's boy outgunned Snake-Eye Jackson himself." Will remained seated, the Winchester still within easy reach. "Wasn't trying to put on a show, Sheriff." "No," Marcus agreed, studying the young man carefully. "That's what makes it more impressive. Jackson's got a reputation as one of the fastest guns in 3 territories, yet here you sit, calm as Sunday morning, after sending him running with his tail between his legs." James Hawthorne stirred in his chair, his damaged arm twitching slightly. "My boy was just protecting what's ours, Marcus. Nothing more to it than that. But there was more to it, much more, and everyone on that porch knew it." Manuel walked the yard, examining the scene with practiced eyes. He stopped at each spent cartridge, noting their placement, reconstructing the sequence of shots in his mind. "Sheriff!" Manuel called out, his voice tight with amazement. "You need to see this." He pointed to the series of shots, tracing their trajectory. First shot took Jackson's hat, second and third disarmed his men, and the fourth— He shook his head in disbelief. The fourth shot went through Jackson's coat without touching him. That's not just shooting, that's something else entirely. Marcus had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made his blood run cold. In all his years wearing a badge, he'd never seen shooting like that. Not even James, in his prime, had shown such precision, such absolute control. "Will," Marcus spoke carefully, "I think it's time we had a real conversation about what's really happening in Rattlesnake Valley. Jackson and his mining friends, they're just the surface of something much deeper." Will's eyes narrowed slightly. "What do you mean?" Marcus glanced at James, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Your father knows some of this from before his accident. The mining company's just a cover. The real prize is what's under Rattlesnake Valley, gold and lots of it. The kind of wealth that makes men forget their souls." "That's why they want the pass," Will said softly, pieces falling into place. "Exactly." Marcus pulled out a worn letter from his vest pocket. "Got this from the territorial marshal last week. Jackson's working for more than just mining interests. There's a man named Victor Blackwood behind it all, a businessman from back east with connections all the way to Washington. He's been buying up land across 3 territories, using the mining company as a front." James Hawthorne's hands gripped his chair's armrests, his knuckles white. "Blackwood," he spat the name like poison. "Should have known he'd be behind this." Will turned to his father, surprise flickering across his face. "Pa?" "Victor Blackwood was in Carson City that day," James said, his voice heavy with old pain. "The day of the accident. He'd made an offer on the ranch the week before, offered enough money to set us up for life. When I refused—" "The accident wasn't an accident," Marcus finished quietly. "We could never prove it, but someone had. Tampered with James's gun. The timing was too perfect, the stakes too high." Will absorbed this information, his face unreadable, but Marcus, watching closely, saw something change in the young man's eyes. A hardening, a focus, like a rifle being sighted on a distant target. "Blackwood's men have been moving systematically through the valley," Marcus continued. "The Martinez and Peterson places were just the start. They're clearing out anyone who might resist when they make their big move. And our ranch, sitting right at the pass, is the key to everything," Will finished. "That's why Jackson came himself, why they sent their best." Manuel had returned to the porch, his weathered face grim. "And now that you've shown your hand, oh boy, they'll come at you harder. Blackwood's not a man who takes defeat lightly." "Good." Will's voice was soft, but carried an edge that made everyone on the porch go still, "because I've got some questions about Carson City that need answering." James reached out with his good hand, gripping his son's arm. "Will, no, these men, what they did to me was just business to them, but if you go after Blackwood—" "They made it personal, Pa." Will cut him off gently. "The moment they decided, our land was worth more than your life, they made it very personal indeed." Marcus watched the interplay between father and son, seeing the weight of destiny settling on young shoulders. But there was something else that worried him, something about the way Will had handled Jackson and his men. "Your shooting," Marcus said carefully. "It wasn't just good. It was perfect. Too perfect. The kind of shooting that makes men nervous, makes them wonder what else you can do." Will met his gaze steadily. "What are you asking, Sheriff?" "I'm asking if you're ready for what comes next. Word of this morning's show will spread like wildfire. Every gunfighter and glory seeker between here and the Mississippi will want to test themselves against Hawthorne's Prodigy son. And Blackwood. He'll send worse than Jackson next time. Let them come." Will's hand rested on the Winchester, his fingers tracing patterns worn smooth by years of practice. "Pa taught me more than just shooting. He taught me about responsibility, about standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. And I taught you too well, perhaps," James said softly. Taught you things I promised your mother you'd never need to know." A heavy silence fell over the porch, broken only by the wind through the grass and the distant low of cattle. Marcus studied the young man before him, seeing not just James Hawthorne's son, but something more, a force of nature wrapped in human form, as dangerous and precise as a summer lightning strike. "There's more," Marcus finally said. "The territorial marshal's letter mentions something else. Blackwood's not just after gold. He's building an empire out here, using men like Jackson to create chaos so he can step in with his own brand of order, the kind of order that comes with strings attached and blood on the ground." Will nodded slowly. "And now I've become a complication in his plans." "More than that," Manuel interjected. "You've become a symbol. The ranch hands were talking about it before I rode out, about how Hawthorne's boy stood up to Jackson's gang. People are starting to hope again, starting to believe they can resist." "Hope's dangerous," Marcus warned. "Blackwood will want to crush it quick, make an example." "He can try." Will's voice was quiet but carried the certainty of a well-aimed bullet. "But Pa also taught me that some things are worth fighting for. This land, this valley, the people who call it home, they're worth more than Blackwood's, or gold, or his empire dreams." James Hawthorne struggled to his feet, his damaged arm trembling with the effort. "Then we'll fight them together, son. These old bones might not be what they were, but I've still got some fight left in me." Marcus saw the emotion flash across Will's face, pride, love, and something fiercer, like a wolf protecting its pack. The simple confrontation with Jackson had evolved into something far larger, a battle for the soul of Rattlesnake Valley itself. "I'll send word to the territorial marshal," Marcus decided. "Let him know what's really happening here. But Will—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Whatever happens next, remember, a gun can be a tool or a curse. Your father learned that the hard way in Carson City." "I remember everything about Carson City," Will said, his voice carrying an edge that made even Manuel step back. "Every detail, every shadow, every face in the crowd that day. And soon Victor Blackwood's going to remember it too." The morning sun had climbed higher, burning away the last traces of gun smoke from the yard, but as Marcus mounted up to ride back to town, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real smoke, the kind that came with war and reckoning, was just beginning to rise over Rattlesnake Valley. The news of Will Hawthorne's confrontation with Snake-Eye Jackson spread through Rattlesnake Valley like a prairie fire. By sunset, Elena's Cafe had become an unofficial gathering place for those seeking details of the morning's events. The story grew with each telling. 4 shots had become 6, then 8, each version more spectacular than the last. But those who knew the truth understood that the reality was far more impressive than any embellishment. Maria Ortiz stood behind her store counter, watching Will through the front window as he picked up supplies. The young man moved differently. Now she noticed. The careful way he'd always carried himself had transformed into something more deliberate, more aware. Every rancher and cowhand in the store gave him a wide berth, their conversations dropping to whispers as he passed. "Quite a change from yesterday," old Pete Wilson observed, settling his bulk against Maria's counter. The retired stage driver had seen his share of gunfighters in his day. "Boy's carrying a heavy burden now." "Fame's a dangerous thing in these parts," Maria replied quietly, nodding toward 2 strangers lounging outside the saloon across the street. They'd arrived an hour after word of Jackson's humiliation had reached town, their city clothes and careful posture marking them as more than simple travelers. Will finished his shopping, loading supplies into his saddlebags with methodical precision. As he worked, a small figure darted from between the buildings, young Miguel Martinez, whose family's ranch had burned just last week. The boy couldn't have been more than 12, but his eyes held the hard look of someone who'd seen too much. "Mr. Hawthorne," Miguel called out, his voice cracking with emotion. "Is it true what they're saying? Did you really outshoot Snake-Eye Jackson?" Will paused in his work, studying the boy carefully. "Shouldn't believe everything you hear, Miguel." "But you did stand up to them," Miguel pressed. "You showed them they can't just take whatever they want." The boy's hands were clenched into fists, his whole body trembling with barely contained rage and grief. Maria watched as something shifted in Will's expression, a softening around the eyes, though his voice remained steady. "I'm sorry about your family's ranch, Miguel, about your pa. They said it was an accident," Miguel spat, "said the fire just happened. But I saw them, Mr. Hawthorne. Saw Jackson's men riding away that night. Pa tried to fight them, but—" His voice broke. Will knelt down to the boy's level, his movement drawing worried glances from the strangers across the street. "Sometimes standing up isn't about being the fastest gun," he said quietly. "It's about knowing when to fight and when to wait. Your pa was a brave man, Miguel. Don't let anyone tell you differently." "Will you teach me?" Miguel blurted out. "To shoot like you? I want to make them pay for what they did." A heavy silence fell over the street. Maria held her breath, seeing the weight of the moment settle on Will's shoulders. His response would ripple through the community, setting a tone for what was to come. "Revenge is a poison, Miguel," Will finally said, his voice carrying clearly. "In the hushed street, it burns you up inside, leaving nothing but ashes." He stood slowly, his hand resting briefly on the boy's shoulder. "But justice, that's something worth waiting for, something worth doing right." The distinction wasn't lost on those listening. Maria saw heads nodding, saw the way people stood a little straighter. Will wasn't just refusing to train a child for revenge. He was teaching a lesson about the difference between vengeance and justice that the whole town needed to hear. As if to punctuate the moment, horses approached from the north end of town, a group of riders led by none other than Frank Cooper, owner of the largest spread north of Rattlesnake Valley. Cooper was known as a hard man but a fair one, and his word carried weight with ranchers across 3 territories. "Hawthorne," Cooper called out, reining in his horse. "Got a moment to talk business?" Will finished securing his saddlebags, his movements unhurried. "Always time for business, Mr. Cooper." "Heard about this morning," Cooper said, dismounting, with the grace of a man half his age. "Heard how you handled Jackson and his boys. Got me thinking about a proposition." The strangers across the street had straightened, their casual poses forgotten as they strained to hear the conversation. Maria noticed Will had positioned himself so he could watch them in the reflection of her store window, a subtle move that spoke volumes about his situational awareness. "Blackwood's been pushing all of us," Cooper continued, his voice pitched low but carrying enough for those nearby to hear. "Buying some out, burning others out. But if we stood together, if we formed an association of ranchers, presented a united front, they'd just bring in more men," Will observed quietly. "More guns, more fire, unless we had something they couldn't ignore." Cooper's eyes glinted. "Like proof of what really happened in Carson City. Proof that Blackwood's empire is built on murder and fraud." Will's hand had drifted to his Winchester, though the movement seemed more reflexive than intentional. "What kind of proof?" "Got a friend in Carson City," Cooper said. "Former marshal who investigated your father's accident. Says he found things that didn't add up, things that were buried before they could come to light. He's willing to talk, but only in person, only to James Hawthorne's son." The implications hung in the air like gunsmoke. This wasn't just about protecting one ranch anymore. It was about exposing a conspiracy that stretched back years. The strangers across the street had given up any pretense of casualness, openly watching the exchange. 3 days, Cooper replied when Will asked simply. "In Promise City. My men will help watch your spread while you're gone." He paused, studying the young man carefully. "This is bigger than Jackson's threats or Blackwood's gold, son. This is about something that's been rotting in the territory for years. The question, Are you ready to pull it up by the roots?" Will's response was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Kane, riding hard from the direction of the telegraph office. The look on his face told its own story. Something had happened, something that would change the game yet again. "Will!" Marcus called out, his voice tight with urgency. "Wire just came in from the territorial marshal. Blackwood himself is coming. Left Carson City 2 days ago with a train of hired guns. And he's bringing someone with him, someone who knows your father." The street had gone deadly quiet, every ear straining to catch the sheriff's next words. Will stood motionless, his face unreadable, but Maria saw his trigger finger tap once against his holster, a tell she'd noticed whenever he was processing something significant. "Who?" Will's voice was soft, but carried clearly in the silence. Marcus swallowed hard. "Luke Lightning Lancaster, the man who shot against your father in that exhibition, the one who was supposed to lose but didn't." The name fell like a stone in still water, sending ripples of whispers through the gathered crowd. Lancaster was a legend in his own right, a shooter whose speed was matched only by his ruthlessness. If he was coming with Blackwood, 3 days, Will said, turning back to Cooper. "I'll be in Promise City, but first I need to have a conversation with my father about Luke Lancaster and the truth about what really happened in Carson City." The storm that had been brewing over Rattlesnake Valley was about to break, and everyone present knew that when it did, nothing would ever be the same again. The evening sun cast long shadows across the Hawthorne Ranch as Will found his father. In the old practice yard behind the barn, James Hawthorne stood before the worn targets he'd set up years ago, his damaged arm held close to his chest, his good hand tracing the weathered posts as if reading a story written in the bullet-scarred. "Wood, you should have told me about Lancaster," Will said quietly, stopping a few paces behind his father. James didn't turn around. "Some stories are better left buried, son. Some ghosts should stay in their graves. Not these ghosts, Pa. Not anymore." Will moved closer, noting how his father's shoulders tensed at the name he hadn't spoken yet. "Luke Lightning Lancaster is riding with Blackwood. They'll be here in less than a week." The change in James was immediate and disturbing. The former champion shooter spun around with surprising speed, his face pale, his good hand trembling. No, that's not possible. Lancaster disappeared after Carson City. Nobody's seen him in years." Sheriff Kane got the wire himself. "Lancaster's coming, and I need to know what really happened that day. All of it." James stumbled to a nearby bench, suddenly looking every one of his years, and then some. The setting sun painted harsh lines across his face as he struggled with memories he'd tried to drown in whiskey for years. It was supposed to be simple. He finally began, his voice barely above a whisper. "A standard exhibition match. Lancaster was Blackwood's man, had been for years, though nobody knew it then. The plan was for him to make a good showing but lose gracefully. Blackwood would use the publicity to promote his new venture capital firm, and I'd get enough money to expand the ranch." Will settled onto the bench beside his father, watching the play of emotions across the older man's face. But something went wrong. Something wrong. James laughed bitterly. Everything went wrong. The day before the exhibition, Blackwood came to me with a new proposal, said he'd bought up most of the valley already, showed me papers to prove it. I wanted our ranch too, and said it was the key to everything, offered enough money to set us up for life, but you refused. This land was your grandfather's dream, son. He died making it work, and I swore I'd never sell." James's good hand clenched into a fist. "Blackwood, he didn't take rejection well, said I'd regret choosing dirt over dollars." "Next day at the exhibition," Will prompted softly, though he suspected what was coming. Lancaster wasn't playing to lose. He was playing for keeps. James closed his eyes, lost in the memory. "The first shot felt wrong. The second shot blew the gun apart in my hands. The pain! I thought I'd died right there in front of all those people. And Lancaster played it perfectly. Rushed to help, acted devastated that his friendly competition had ended in tragedy. Blackwood's doctors were right there, whisking me away before anyone could ask too many questions. By the time I realized what had really happened, the evidence was gone, and Lancaster had vanished. James's voice had grown hoarse with emotion. That's why I taught you to always load your own ammunition, why I made you learn to spot tampered cartridges. Taught me everything you could, Will nodded. Every trick, every technique, every lesson you'd learned the hard way. Prayed I'd never need them, but you knew. Knew someday Blackwood would come back to finish what he started. A noise from the house drew their attention. Manuel approaching with a lantern, his face grave in the gathering dusk. "Rider coming," he announced without preamble. "Jackson's back, and he's not alone." Will stood, his hand dropping instinctively to his Winchester. "How many?" "Dozen. Maybe more. Moving slow, taking their time." Manuel's eyes shifted to James. "They're led by a man in a black duster riding a pale horse." James Hawthorne went even paler. "Lancaster, he's early." "No." Will's voice was iron. "That's not Lancaster. Jackson's. Trying to rattle us, using what he's learned about Carson City, testing our nerves." His father struggled to his feet. "Son, if it is Lancaster..." "It's not." Will's certainty was absolute. "Lancaster's with Blackwood, and Blackwood's the kind of man who makes an entrance. When they come, it'll be with an army at their backs, not a dozen riders in the dark." Manuel nodded approvingly. "Boy's right, James. This is Jackson trying to press his advantage while he can. Word's spreading about how your son handled him this morning. Man like that, his reputation's all he has. He'll want revenge before Blackwood arrives to take over." The sound of hooves grew clearer, accompanied by the jingle of tack and the low murmur of men who thought themselves predators. Will did a quick mental calculation. 12 riders meant 72 potential shots if they all carried 6 shooters. The yard offered cover, but the approaching night would make accuracy a challenge. "Manuel," Will said quietly, "get my father inside. Bar the doors. Stay away from the windows." He checked his ammunition automatically, though he knew exactly how many rounds he carried. "And send word to Sheriff Kane if you can. Tell him Jackson's chosen his side." "Will, no!" James gripped his son's arm with surprising strength. "You can't face them alone. Not in the dark. Not like this." But Will was already moving, his steps sure and deliberate as he headed for the front of the house. "Pa," he called back softly, "remember what you taught me about night shooting? About how to use the muzzle flash to spot targets? Every target, eventually, runs out of luck." James quoted himself from years ago, his voice breaking. "But a true marksman makes his own luck," Will assured him, pausing at the corner of the barn. "I won't be alone. I've got years of your lessons watching over me, and Jackson's about to learn that some things are better left in the dark." The riders were closer now, their approach deliberate and menacing in the last light of day. Will could make out the black duster of their leader, pristine and proud, a deliberate mockery of the man who had nearly killed his father years ago. A slight smile touched Will's lips as he moved into position. Jackson thought he was being clever, using the Carson City story to create fear. But he'd made a crucial mistake. He'd given Will something he'd been seeking for years. A chance to rewrite the story of that exhibition day, to show the world that the Hawthorne name still stood for something. The night wind carried the sound of Jackson's voice, a call that was equal parts bravado and desperation, but Will had stopped, listening. His world had narrowed to distances and angles, to the weight of his Winchester in his hand and the lessons written in bullet-scarred wood behind the barn. The ghost of Carson City was about to be laid to rest, one shot at a time. The night had turned the practice yard into a maze of shadows, each deeper than the last. Jackson's riders spread out in a loose semicircle at the edge of the Hawthorne property. their horses nervous in the growing dark. The black duster gleamed like a beacon, its wearer clearly wanting to be seen. "Come on out, boy." Jackson's voice carried across the yard, heavy with false bravado. "Time to finish what we started this morning." Will stood motionless in the shadow of the barn, watching, waiting. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Patience is a shooter's best friend. Let them make the first mistake." He could hear Manuel barricading the house behind him, could feel his father's presence at an upstairs window, despite his instructions to stay back. "You really think that duster makes you Lancaster?" Will called back, his voice pitched to carry. "A man like that wouldn't need 12 guns at his back to face one boy." A murmur ran through Jackson's men. The black duster shifted as its wearer stiffened. "Awful confidence for someone outgunned 12-1, Jackson snarled. "Lancaster's just a story. This is business." "No," Will's voice had grown colder. "This stopped being business when you tried using Carson City to scare us, when you made it personal." He stepped away from the barn, letting the last light catch him. "But since you want to play at being Lancaster, let's make it interesting. You and me, Jackson. 1 shot each, just like the exhibition." More muttering from the gathered riders. Jackson's reputation was on the line. He couldn't back down from a direct challenge, not with his men watching, but Will had offered him something dangerous. A chance to prove himself against Hawthorne's Prodigy son. 1 shot. Jackson's laugh was harsh in the gathering dark. "Boy, I'm going to need just 1 shot to finish you." "Then prove it." Will took another step forward. "Or take off that duster and admit you're not half the gunman you pretend to be." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the horses seemed to hold their breath. Will counted heartbeats, measuring the distance, noting how Jackson's men had unconsciously shifted to give their leader room. Pride was about to make Jackson do exactly what Will needed him to do. "Fine." Jackson dismounted with elaborate care. 1 shot each. "But when I win, your father signs over the ranch tonight. And when you lose," Will's voice carried the certainty of a bullet's trajectory, "you ride out of Rattlesnake Valley and never come back, you or your men." Jackson's hand dropped to his gun. "Deal. On 3. On 3. The count seemed to take forever, each number hanging in the air like smoke. 1. Will's world narrowed to essential details, the subtle shift of Jackson's weight, the way his gun hand twitched slightly. 2. The black duster gleamed in the last light, a perfect target. Jackson's men leaned forward in their saddles, eager to witness history. Jackson drew before the last word left his mouth, exactly as Will had known he would. The shot rang out loud in the confined space of the yard, but Will was no longer where he had been, his father's training taking over as he moved like flowing water. His own shot came a heartbeat later, deliberate and precise. The black duster blossomed with holes before it hit the ground, and Will had fired twice more, his Winchester seeming to leap to his shoulder of its own accord. Jackson's gun went spinning, away, along with any illusion that he could match Lancaster's legend. "That's 3 shots, Mr. Jackson," Will said quietly into the stunned silence. "1 to match your cheat, 1 to disarm you, and 1 to remind you that I could have killed you at any point." He tilted his head slightly. "Would you like to see what I can do with the other 5 bullets? Jackson stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and growing fear. But movement from his men shattered the moment, several reaching for their guns, despite the odds they had just witnessed. What followed would be talked about in Rattlesnake Valley for years to come. Will moved with impossible speed and precision. His shots coming so fast they seemed to overlap. Guns flew from hands, hats leaped from heads, and in one spectacular display, a rider's reins were shot cleanly through, leaving him clutching his saddle horn as his horse backed away in panic. When the echo of gunfire faded, not a single man among Jackson's crew remained armed. The ground was littered with dropped weapons, yet not a drop of blood had been spilled. 8 shots, Will announced into the ringing silence. Still got enough left in the magazine for anyone who wants to try for an even dozen. No one moved. Even Jackson seemed rooted to the spot, his previous bravado replaced by the sickening realization that he'd badly underestimated what he was facing. "Boy's not natural," one of the riders muttered, crossing himself. "Devil's work, shooting like that in the dark." "Not the devil," James Hawthorne's voice carried from the house, strong and clear for the first time in years. "Just my son. Now, get off our land before he decides to start aiming for something besides hats and hardware." The retreat was nearly comical in its haste. Riders scrambled for their dropped weapons, none willing to be the last one in the yard. Jackson mounted his horse with shaking hands, his face visible in the emerging moonlight, all color drained, and from it, leaving him looking like a ghost of his former self. "This isn't over," he managed, though his voice lacked conviction. "Blackwood's coming, Lancaster's coming. They'll find me waiting," Will cut him off. "And Jackson, leave the duster. Black's not your color." As the riders disappeared into the night, Will finally allowed himself to feel the tension drain from his shoulders. The confrontation had gone exactly as he'd planned, a display of skill dramatic enough to spread word far and wide, but without the bloodshed that would have brought immediate retaliation. Manuel emerged from the house, lantern held high. "Sweet Jesus, boy, I counted 8 shots but could have sworn I heard only 4. Speed's not about how fast you pull the trigger," Will quoted his father's lessons. "It's about making time work for you instead of against you." James Hawthorne made his way down to the yard, his steps steadier than they'd been in years. He knelt painfully, picking up the fallen black duster, examining the perfect holes Will's shots had created. "You knew," he said softly, "knew Jackson would try to use Lancaster's reputation, knew his pride would make him accept the challenge." Will nodded. "And knew his men would need a demonstration they couldn't ignore. By morning, every ranch in the territory will hear about this. They'll know Jackson isn't invincible. They'll know more than that," Manuel said grimly. "They'll know the Hawthorne name still means something, that there's someone standing against Blackwood and his empire." He paused, looking at Will with new respect. "But son, you've just painted a mighty big target on your back." "Good." Will holstered his Winchester with fluid grace. "Because I'm counting on Blackwood hearing about this. Counting on him understanding exactly what's waiting for him in Rattlesnake Valley." He turned to his father. "And counting on Lancaster wanting one last shot at Hawthorne." James studied his son in the lantern light, seeing not just the boy he'd trained, but the man he'd become. "You're using Jackson to send a message." "Several messages," Will corrected. "To Blackwood, to the valley, but mostly to Lancaster. He needs to know that what happened in Carson City won't happen again, that this time Hawthorne is ready for him." The night wind carried the distant sound of Jackson's retreat, along with the promise of storms to come. But for now, in the bullet-marked yard of his father's ranch, Will Hawthorne stood unchanged by his display of prowess. The quiet son of a fallen champion had shown his hand, revealing a talent that would draw killers like moths to a flame. The real battle for Rattlesnake Valley was about to begin. The next morning dawned harsh and bright over the Hawthorne ranch, the rising sun casting long shadows across the yard where spent cartridges still lay like brass seeds in the dust. Word of the night's events had spread faster than anyone could have anticipated. By sunrise, riders were already appearing on the horizon, coming to see for themselves the place where Snake-Eye Jackson's reputation had been shattered by a boy with a Winchester. Sheriff Kane arrived first, his expression a mixture of concern and grudging admiration as he surveyed the scene. 12 men, he said, shaking his head. 12 experienced gun hands, and not a drop of blood spilled. That's not just skill, Will. That's something else entirely. Will sat cleaning his rifle on the porch, just as he had the day before, though everything else had changed. Had to be clean, he said quietly. Blackwood's the kind of man who'd use any excuse to bring the law down on us. Dead bodies would have given him that excuse. Speaking of Blackwood, Marcus produced a fresh telegram from his vest pocket. Got more news from Carson City. He's not traveling alone, bringing a special train, private car and all. Word is he's got at least 30 guns with him, maybe more. James Hawthorne stirred in his chair. A man doesn't bring that kind of force, unless he's planning a war, or unless he's afraid, Will observed, his hands never pausing in their work. Last night wasn't just about Jackson, it was about sending a message. Blackwood needs to understand that this time he's not facing a simple exhibition shooter he can intimidate or trick. You're playing a dangerous game, son, Marcus warned. Men like Blackwood, they don't take kindly to being challenged. And Lancaster's the key, Will interrupted. Everything I did last night, the precision, the showing off, it was meant for him. He needs to wonder, needs to think about every shot he's ever made and whether it was good enough. Frank Cooper rode in around mid-morning, bringing news from the northern ranges. It's working, he reported, dismounting near the porch. Jackson's men scattered to the four winds, telling stories in every saloon between here and Promise City. Some say you can shoot the spots off a playing card at 50 paces. Others swear you knew exactly where every man would draw before they did. Let them talk, Will said. Fear's a powerful weapon, Mr. Cooper, sometimes more powerful than bullets. And what about Promise City? James asked. The meeting with the former marshal. Still on, Cooper confirmed. But there's more. The ranchers are gathering there, men who've lost land to Blackwood schemes, families burned out when they refuse to sell. They're waiting to hear what you'll do, Will. You've become something of a symbol. Not a symbol, Will corrected. Just a man standing up for what's right, same as anyone would do if they had the means. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Maria Ortiz's wagon, loaded with supplies and ammunition. On credit, she announced before anyone could protest. To be paid back when this is over. The whole town's behind you now. It was true. Throughout the morning, more people arrived, ranchers offering men and rifles, townspeople bringing food and supplies, even old Pete Wilson with his ancient buffalo gun and a box of carefully hoarded cartridges. Each one had a story about Blackwood's cruelty, about homes lost and lives ruined by his empire building. By noon, the Hawthorne Ranch had become an impromptu headquarters for what was rapidly becoming a people's resistance. Maps were spread on makeshift tables, defensive positions marked, communication lines established. Will watched it all with quiet intensity, his mind working through angles and trajectories just as his father had taught him. Only now he was calculating more than just bullet paths. You understand what you've started? James asked softly when they had a moment alone. This isn't just about our ranch anymore. These people, they're putting their lives, their futures in your hands. They're putting their faith in something bigger than me, Pa, Will replied, in the idea that one person standing up gives others the courage to stand too. Blackwood's empire is built on fear. Fear of his money, his connections, his hired guns. But fear only works when people think they're alone. James studied his son, seeing shadows of his own younger self, but tempered with something else, a calculated precision that went beyond mere shooting skill. Lancaster will try to goad you, he warned. He's a showman as much as a gunman. He'll want to make it personal, public. Good. Will's voice held that same quiet certainty that had marked every shot the night before. Because I want him thinking about the show. I want him to remember every trick shot and exhibition move he knows. The more he thinks about showing off, the less he'll think about what I'm really planning. The afternoon brought more visitors, including Elena Rodriguez with food from her cafe and news from town. "Two more of Blackwood's men arrived an hour ago," she reported. "City types, watching everything, asking questions about last night. One of them was taking notes in a little book." "Making plans," Sheriff Kane growled. "Trying to figure out how to handle you, Will." "Let them plan," Will said, his eyes distant as he watched hawks circle over the valley. "Every minute they spend trying to understand what happened with Jackson is a minute they're not thinking about what's coming next." As the sun began its descent, casting the same long shadows that had hidden Will during the previous night's confrontation, Manuel approached with fresh concern on his weathered face. "Rider coming," he announced. "Single horseman, white flag." Through his father's spyglass, Will could make out the approaching figure, a man in elegant city clothes, riding with the stiff posture of someone more comfortable in offices than saddles. "Blackwood's lawyer," Cooper spat, recognizing the rider. "Nathan Pierce, the man who makes all his land grabs look legal on paper." Will handed the spyglass back to his father. "Time to find out what kind of offer they think might tempt us after last night." "Be careful, son," James warned. "Pierce's words are as dangerous as any bullet. Man can make crushing a family sound like a business opportunity." "Don't worry, Pa." Will's smile held no warmth. "I learned from you that some things aren't for sale, and some debts can only be paid in lead and brass." The lawyer reined in at the edge of the yard, taking in the gathering of armed men and supplies with poorly concealed distaste. His eyes lingered on Will, measuring, calculating, before he reached into his saddlebag and produced an official-looking envelope. "Mr. Hawthorne," he called out, his voice carrying the cultured tones of Eastern schooling. "I bring a message from Mr. Victor Blackwood. In light of recent events, he wishes to propose a new arrangement." The battle for Rattlesnake Valley was entering a new phase, and as Will stepped off the porch to hear Blackwood's latest offer, he could almost feel Lancaster's ghost watching, waiting to see how James Hawthorne's son would handle the opening. Moves of a game that could only end in gunsmoke and truth. Nathan Pierce sat his horse with the discomfort of a man who'd spent more time behind desks than in saddles, the evening sun casting his shadow long across the Hawthorne's yard. The lawyer's eyes moved constantly, taking in details that would later fill pages of careful notes. The gathered ranches, the stockpile of supplies, the way young Will Hawthorne moved with the same deliberate precision, whether handling papers or firearms. "Mr. Blackwood," Pierce began, his voice carrying the polished tones of Boston schooling, "is a reasonable man. He understands that certain misunderstandings have led to unfortunate tensions. He's prepared to be generous." Will stood in the yard, positioned so that his father on the porch remained in his peripheral vision. "Generous like he was in Carson City." A flicker of unease crossed Pierce's face. "The past is the past, Mr. Hawthorne. What matters is the future. My client is prepared to offer 3 times the market value for your ranch, plus guaranteed grazing rights for your cattle on adjacent lands. A very generous proposition considering recent events." "Recent events," Frank Cooper echoed from the porch, his voice heavy with sarcasm. "What are we calling burned-out ranches and murdered families now?" "Mr. Cooper," Pierce's tone grew colder, "my client's business dealings with other parties are not relevant to this discussion. What is relevant is the opportunity being presented to young Mr. Hawthorne here, an opportunity to secure his father's comfort for life, to build something greater than a simple ranch." "Something greater." Will's voice remained quiet, but it carried across the yard with the same precision as his shots the night before. "Like what you built in Carson City, in Silver Peak, in every territory where good people mysteriously decided to sell their land just before gold or silver was discovered." Pierce's practiced composure slipped slightly. "You seem very well informed about my client's business ventures." Information's like ammunition, Mr. Pierce. Best to keep it dry and ready. Will took a step forward, causing the lawyer to grip his reins tighter. So let's talk about real information, like how the Territorial Marshal's office is very interested in what happened to their investigator after he started looking into my father's accident, or how certain banking records in Carson City might show exactly who paid for the tampering of exhibition firearms. The lawyer's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. Allegations without proof are dangerous things, young man, especially when made against someone of Mr. Blackwood's standing. Proof's coming, Will said simply. 3 days from now in Promise City. Former Marshal Phillips sends his regards, by the way. Says he's kept certain documents safe and dry, just waiting for the right moment. The change in Pierce was subtle but immediate. A tightening around the eyes, a slight straightening of his spine. I see. Then perhaps we should discuss a different kind of arrangement. My client is willing to be very generous indeed to anyone who might help prevent unnecessary complications. A heavy silence fell over the yard. Will could feel the gathered ranchers tense, could sense his father's grip tightening on his rifle stock. The lawyer had just moved from legitimate business to outright bribery, and everyone present knew it. That's quite an offer, Will said, his voice thoughtful. Mind if I show you something in return? Without waiting for a response, he drew his father's Winchester with liquid grace. The motion was so smooth, so casual, that it took Pierce a moment to realize he was staring down the barrel of the rifle that had humbled Snake Eye Jackson's entire gang. Last night, Will continued conversationally, I put 8 shots exactly where I wanted them in near darkness. Would you like to see what I can do in full daylight? Is that a threat, Mr. Hawthorne? Pierce's cultured voice had acquired a slight tremor. No, sir, just a demonstration of value. You see, your client might be generous with money, but my father was generous with something far more precious, knowledge. Everything he knew about angles, trajectories, the pure mathematics of making lead go where you want it to go. Will's aim never wavered. So, let me make a counter-offer. You ride back to your client and deliver a message. Tell him I know about Carson City. Tell him former Marshal Phillips knows too, and tell him that when Lancaster tries what he tried with my father, I'll be ready. Every angle calculated, every trajectory mapped, every possible shot accounted. Before Lancaster, Pierce attempted surprise, but his voice betrayed him. I don't know what you're... Yes, you do. Will's tone remained conversational, but his eyes had taken on the same focused quality they held when solving complex shooting problems. You know exactly why Blackwood's bringing him, just like you know what really happened in Carson City. The question is, does Lancaster know? Does he know he was just a tool, that Blackwood planned to ruin my father's shooting arm from the start? That all his pride in being the man who outshot James Hawthorne was built on a lie? The lawyer's composure cracked completely. You can't improve any of that. 3 days, Mr. Pierce. Promise City, proof enough to hang men who think they're above the law. Will lowered the Winchester slightly. Now, ride back to your client and think carefully about which side of this you want to be on when the truth comes out. Because Blackwood's empire isn't the only thing built on lies. So is your law practice. And lies have a way of coming home, just like bullets. As Pierce wheeled his horse around, Will added casually, oh, and one more thing. Next time Blackwood sends a messenger, make sure they understand this land was bought with blood and sweat. Trying to buy it with dirty money is an insult that might be answered with lead. The gathered ranchers watched the lawyer's hasty departure in silence. Finally, Frank Cooper spoke. You think he bought it? About Phillips and the proof? Doesn't matter, Will replied, his eyes still on the dust trail of Pierce's retreat. What matters is that he's afraid we might have proof. Fear makes men careless, makes them rush things, and when they rush, they make mistakes. James finished from the porch, pride evident in his voice, just like you knew Jackson would last night. Sheriff Kane had watched the exchange with growing concern. "You're playing a dangerous game, Will. Blackwood's not the kind of man who responds well to threats." "Not threats, Sheriff. Promises." Will turned to face the gathered ranchers and townspeople. "Every one of you has lost something to Blackwood's. Empire, land, family, dignity. He builds his power on the belief that money can buy anything, that every man has his price. But some things aren't for sale. Some things can only be protected by people willing to stand together." The sun was setting now, painting the valley in shades of gold and promise. One by one the ranchers nodded, understanding that they were witnessing more than just a land dispute. This was about something larger, about whether one man's greed could destroy not just lives, but the very soul of the frontier. 3 days, Manuel said quietly. "That's not much time to prepare for what's coming." "Time enough," Will replied, his hand running along the smooth wood of his Winchester. "Pa always said, the right preparation makes time your friend instead of your enemy. Blackwood thinks he's got us outgunned, outmanned, and cornered. But he's forgotten something important." "What's that?" Elena asked from where she stood near Maria Ortiz. "A cornered animal is at its most dangerous when it's not really cornered at all, when it's exactly where it wants to be, waiting for the hunter to make his move." Will's eyes took on that distant look they got when calculating impossible shots. "Blackwood's coming with an army because he's afraid. Lancaster's coming because his pride won't let him back down. And every step they take is one more step into a trap they don't even know exists." James Hawthorne struggled to his feet, his damaged arm held close but his voice strong. "You're betting everything on Promise City, on whatever Phillips might have saved from Carson City." "No, Pa." Will's smile held no warmth. "I'm betting everything on Blackwood being exactly who he is. A man so convinced of his own power that he can't imagine anyone outthinking him. The kind of man who believes that enough money and enough guns can solve any problem." He turned to face the gathered crowd. "But we know different, don't we? We know that some problems can only be solved by people standing together, by communities choosing what kind of future they want to build." The speech might have seemed dramatic from another man, but coming from Will, with his quiet voice and steady hands, it carried the weight of absolute conviction. One by one, the ranchers and townspeople nodded, understanding that they were being called to be part of something larger than themselves. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley, Will began outlining his plan. It was a plan built not just on shooting skill, but on everything his father had taught him about angles and trajectories, about seeing the whole picture instead of just the immediate target. And as he spoke, those gathered began to understand. This wasn't just about saving one ranch or exposing one man's crimes. This was about rewriting the story of the entire valley, one carefully calculated shot at a time. The real question was, would Lancaster understand in time that he was just another of Blackwood's bullets, aimed and fired without regard for anything but the target? Or would pride blind him until it was too late to choose a different path? 3 days would tell. 3 days until Promise City. 3 days until the truth about Carson City came to light. 3 days until Rattlesnake Valley would discover whether one young man's gift for understanding trajectories could change not just bullets' paths, but the course of their entire future. Night fell over the valley like a velvet curtain, bringing with it the kind of quiet that made men remember every creak of leather and whisper of wind. The gathered ranchers had dispersed to their tasks, each carrying a piece of Will's plan with them. Only Frank Cooper remained, studying a map of Promise City by lamplight while Sheriff Kane marked potential trouble spots. Town's got 3 main approaches, Marcus explained, his finger tracing lines on the yellowed paper. Main Street from the north, River Road from the east, and the old mining trail from the west. Blackwood's bound to have men watching all 3. 4 approaches, Will corrected quietly, pointing to a faint line on the map. There's an old cattle trail that runs behind the Presbyterian church. Hasn't been used in years, but it's still there. Pa used to talk about driving cattle through it back before the railroad came. James nodded from his chair. Narrow passage, but it'll hold. Most folks have forgotten it exists. A town grew up around it, built right over parts of it. But if you know where to look. If you know where to look, Will echoed, you can see all sorts of things people think are hidden. His fingers traced another pattern on the map. Like how the old assay office has a clear view of the main street, or how the livery stable's hayloft overlooks both the saloon and the bank. Cooper whistled softly. You've been planning this longer than just today, haven't you, boy? Since, Carson City, Will admitted. Every time Pa told the story, every time he mentioned a detail about the exhibition grounds, about where everyone was standing, I stored it away, started seeing patterns, understanding how Blackwood thinks. He likes to control the high ground and likes to have his men positioned where they can see everything. But this time, Marcus realized, you're going to give him exactly what he wants. Sometimes the best trap is the one your enemy thinks he's setting for you. Will's voice carried that same quiet certainty it held when he was calculating a difficult shot. Blackwood will have men in the assay office, in the livery stable, probably in the church tower too. He'll think he's got every angle covered. And Lancaster? Cooper asked. Where does he fit in all this? Lancaster's the key. Will moved to the window, staring out into the darkness. He's more than just Blackwood's gun. He's his insurance. As long as people believe Lancaster beat my father fair and square, they'll believe anything else Blackwood wants them to believe. But if that story changes... A noise from outside interrupted the conversation. Horses approaching at a gallop. Manuel burst through the door, his face grave. Riders coming from town. Elena sent word. Blackwood's men are moving. They've taken over the telegraph office. Started questioning people about the ranch's defenses. Will absorb this news with characteristic calm. They're trying to cut us off, control what information gets out about what's really happening here. He turned to the sheriff. Marcus, how many deputies can you trust? Really trust? 4, maybe 5. The rest... Kane shrugged. Money talks, and Blackwood's been talking loud lately. That's enough. Get word to them quietly. I want them in Promise City before we arrive, but not together. They should filter in one at a time, take different routes, make it look natural. Cooper nodded approvingly. Like cowboys drifting in for payday. No one looks twice at that. Exactly. Will moved back to the map. Manuel, tell Elena to keep serving drinks and smiling, but have her password to the other businesses. Anyone who stands with us needs to start preparing now. Food, ammunition, medical supplies, everything stored in root cellars and back. Rooms where Blackwood's men won't think to look. What about the ranch? James asked. If they're watching this closely, they'll know when we leave for Promise City. Let them know, Will replied. In fact, let's make it obvious. Tomorrow morning, I want every hand we can spare working on defenses, digging firing positions, stockpiling ammunition where it can be seen. Make it look like we're preparing for a siege. Understanding dawned on Cooper's face. Make them think you're planning to make your stand here. Blackwood thinks in straight lines, Will explained. If he sees us preparing defenses, he'll assume we're planning to fight here. He'll focus his attention on the ranch, maybe even split his forces. What he won't expect is for us to take the fight to him. In Promise City, Marcus finished, where former Marshal Phillips is supposedly waiting, with proof about Carson City. Will's smile held no humor. Phillips isn't coming. A stunned silence fell over the room. Finally, Cooper spoke. But you told Pierce. I told him what he expected to hear. Blackwood's been buying and burning his way across 3 territories. He's bound to have enemies, bound to have left loose ends someone might have gathered up. The idea that someone has proof against him, that's his worst nightmare. And men who are afraid of shadows tend to shoot at anything that moves. "You're playing a dangerous game, son," James said softly. "If Blackwood figures out there is no proof—" "He won't." Will's certainty was absolute, "because he'll be too busy wondering why we're really going to Promise City. He'll have men watching every freight wagon, every stage, every rider coming into town, looking for Phillips or his proof. And while they're watching for shadows, they won't see what's right in front of them," Marcus finished. "But what is right in front of them? What's your real play here, Will?" Before Will could answer, another sound caught their attention. A single gunshot in the distance, followed by the thunder of hooves. Manuel was already moving toward the door when a rider burst into the yard, his horse lathered and blowing hard. "Miguel?" Will recognized the Martinez boy from town. "What are you doing out here at this hour?" "They're burning it." Miguel's voice cracked with emotion. "The archive building behind the courthouse, Blackwood's men set it on fire. All the land records, all the property deeds." The boy's hands were shaking. "I heard them talking. Said they had to clean house before the big show in Promise City." Will's eyes met his father's across the room. In that moment, both men understood. Blackwood wasn't just covering his tracks. He was eliminating any chance of legal challenge to his empire. The fire would destroy not just deeds and records, but any hope of proving his crimes through official or channels. "Miguel," Will's voice was gentle but carried an edge of steel, "ride to Cooper's ranch. Tell his foreman what you saw, then stay there until this is over." As the boy rode off into the night, Will turned back to the gathered men. "Blackwood just showed his hand. He's not just coming to shut us up. He's coming to erase everything that came before. Every deed, every claim, every legal right to the land he's stolen. Once those records burn, it'll be his word against ashes. And his word," James added grimly, "comes backed with gold and guns. Not this time." Will's hand rested on his Winchester, his fingers moving with that unconscious precision that spoke of countless hours of practice. "This time, his word comes. Up against something stronger than gold, something he can't buy or burn." "And what's that?" Cooper asked. "The truth," Will replied simply. "Not just about Carson City or land deeds, but about what kind of future we want for this valley, about whether we let one man's greed destroy everything our families built." He moved to the window, staring out at the distant glow of the burning archive. "Blackwood thinks erasing the past will secure his future, but he's about to learn that some things can't be erased, like the memory of a shot that shouldn't have been possible, or the truth about what really happened in Carson City." The night wind carried the smell of smoke across the valley, a bitter reminder of what they were fighting against. But as Will outlined the next phase of his plan, those gathered began to understand. Sometimes the best shot isn't the one you take, but the one you make your enemy think you're going to take. And sometimes the best weapon isn't a gun at all, but the truth it helps bring to light. Dawn painted Promise City in shades of anticipation, the rising sun catching glints of metal from windows and rooftops where Blackwood's men had positioned themselves during the night. The town seemed to hold its breath, watching, waiting for what everyone knew was coming. Even the morning stage rolled in quieter than usual, its driver's eyes darting nervously between the obvious gunmen stationed along Main Street. 3 days had passed like summer lightning, brief and brilliant and charged with potential violence. Now, as Will Hawthorne rode into town alongside his father, every window and doorway held the promise of ambush. But the young man's eyes moved with practiced precision, noting angles and distances just as they did when calculating impossible. "Shots. 15 on the rooftops," Will said quietly to Sheriff Kane, who rode on his other side. "Another dozen in the windows. They're not even trying to hide anymore." "Blackwood's train arrived an hour ago," Marcus replied. "A private car pulled right up to the depot. The station master says he brought enough men to start a small war." "No," James corrected from Will's left, his damaged arm held close but his voice strong. He brought enough men to finish one. This isn't about starting anything. It's about making sure what happened here gets remembered the way he wants it. Remembered. They weren't alone. Behind them rode Frank Cooper and a carefully selected group of ranchers, each chosen for their steady hands and cooler heads. More supporters had filtered into town over the past 3 days, following Will's instructions, to arrive separately, to look like nothing more than cowboys coming in for supplies or a drink. Your plan still depends on a lot of things going right, Cooper observed, his eyes scanning the street ahead. No. Will's voice held that same quiet certainty it had when he was sighting down his Winchester. It depends on people doing exactly what their nature tells them to do. Blackwood's men will follow orders. Lancaster will follow his pride, and Blackwood himself. He paused as they passed the burnt-out shell of the archive building, its walls still standing, but its contents reduced to ash and memory. Blackwood will follow his greed right to the end. They dismounted in front of the Promise City Hotel, its once welcoming facade now watched by hard-eyed men who made no effort to conceal their weapons. Will helped his father down, noting how James's good hand never strayed far from his gun belt, despite his injury. Quite a reception committee. Elena Rodriguez's voice came from the hotel's entrance. She stood in the doorway, outwardly calm, though. Her eyes held worry. Mr. Blackwood's in the dining room. Says he's been expecting you. I'm sure he has. Will's smile held no warmth. Everything ready? Elena nodded slightly. Just like you asked. Though I still don't understand why. Understanding comes after. Will cut her off gently. Right now, just remember, when you hear the third shot, no matter what else is happening, stick to the plan. The hotel's dining room had been cleared. Of all other guests, its tables pushed to the walls, except for one in the center. Victor Blackwood sat there like a king holding court, his expensive suit and carefully trimmed beard marking him as something foreign to the frontier. But it was his eyes that drew attention, cold and calculating, the eyes of a man who saw people as resources to be used or obstacles to be removed. Lancaster stood behind him, lean and deadly in black, his gun belt worn low in the exhibition. Shooter's style. His face showed no recognition when he saw James, no hint that he remembered the day he'd helped destroy a legend. But his eyes fixed on Will with predatory interest, measuring, assessing. Young Mr. Hawthorne, Blackwood's voice, was cultured, pleasant even. I must admit, you've caused me quite a bit of inconvenience these past few days. My lawyer seemed quite impressed with your demonstration. Wasn't trying to impress anyone, Will replied mildly. Just having a conversation about value, about things that can't be bought. Everything can be bought, boy. Blackwood's smile never reached his eyes. It's just a matter of finding the right price. Your father understood that once, before his unfortunate accident. James stiffened, but Will's hand on his arm kept him still. Speaking of accidents, Will's voice remained conversational. I've been meaning to ask Mr. Lancaster here about Carson City, about exhibition loads and tampered weapons, about how it feels to build a reputation on a lie. The change in Lancaster was electric. His hand dropped to his gun, but Blackwood's raised finger stopped him. Now, Luke, the boy's just trying to provoke you. Though I must admit, he turned back to Will, I'm curious about these allegations. I understood you had proof, some former marshal with documented evidence. Yet I don't see anyone matching that description here. Maybe he's running late, Will suggested. Or maybe there are other kinds of proof, the kind that can't be burned up in a convenient fire. For the first time, Blackwood's composure slipped slightly. I'm not sure what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. Will's eyes never left Lancaster's face. I'm stating facts, like the fact that exhibition ammunition has a very specific powder load. Too much or too little, and the shot pattern changes. The kind of thing a real exhibition Shooter would notice right away. Isn't that right, Mr. Lancaster? Lancaster's face had gone still, his eyes narrow. You trying to say something, boy? Just wondering if you ever checked the loads that day. Or if you were too focused on your part in the show to notice they weren't regulation. Too busy playing your role to realize you were just another one of Mr. Blackwood's tools. That's enough! Lancaster's voice cracked like a whip. I don't know what kind of story you've cooked up, but I beat your father fair and square. Everyone saw it. They saw what they were meant to see, Will agreed. Just like they saw what they were meant to see when Jackson came to our ranch, when he played at being you, wearing that black duster, thinking reputation and nerve were enough. I heard about that. Lancaster's smile was cruel. Heard you got lucky with a few trick shots in the dark. But this isn't some night show for ranch hands, boy. This is about proving who's the better man. No. Will's voice had gone softer, more dangerous. This is about truth, about choices, about whether a man who built his name on a lie is ready to hear the truth about Carson City. He took a step forward, causing every gun in the room to focus on him. You were good, Mr. Lancaster, maybe even great. But Blackwood couldn't risk a fair contest, couldn't risk his plan falling apart because of honest competition. So he stacked the deck, loaded the guns, and let you take the credit for destroying a man's life. Something flickered in Lancaster's eyes, doubt perhaps, or the first glimmer of understanding, but Blackwood's laugh cut through the tension like a knife. Fascinating theory, young man. But that's all it is, a theory. Now let's discuss reality. Your father's ranch sits on the only viable pass through the mountains. That pass is vital to certain business interests. Those interests are willing to be very generous to avoid unnecessary complications, like the complications in Carson City. Will's question hung in the air like gun smoke, or like the complications your men tried to burn away last night. Must be hard, keeping track of all the lies, all the crimes, all the lives destroyed to build your empire. It must be even harder. Trusting men who know too much. He turned to Lancaster. Tell me something, did you know about the archive fire? About how Blackwood's trying to erase every legal record, every property deed in the territory? Or are you just another weapon in his arsenal, pointed and fired without knowing why? Lancaster's eyes flickered to Blackwood, who sat with the same pleasant smile, but something had changed in the room. The gathered gunmen shifted uneasily, reading the currents of power and loyalty that swirled through the air like dust devils before a storm. You have quite an imagination, Blackwood said smoothly. But I didn't come here to discuss wild theories. I came to offer you a choice. Take my very generous offer, or he let the threat hang, or what? Will's voice carried that same certainty it held when he was calculating trajectories. You'll have Lancaster shoot me like he shot my father? Have your men burn our ranch like they burned the archives? Try to bury the truth under money and violence like you've done everywhere else? He took another step forward, causing every gun in the room to track his movement. But here's what you don't understand, Mr. Blackwood. Every shot has a trajectory. Every action has consequences. And sometimes the target you think you're aiming at isn't the real target at all. The words hung in the air like smoke after a shot. Through the dining room windows, Will could see movement on the street, townspeople, and ranchers positioning themselves exactly as planned, each one playing their part in a dance choreographed down to the smallest detail. Enough riddles, Lancaster snapped, his patience clearly wearing thin. You came here talking about proof, about some marshal with evidence. Where is he? He's not coming, Will said simply. Never was. But you already knew that, didn't you? Mr. Blackwood, had your men watching every road, every trail into town, checking every rider, every wagon, so focused on finding a man who doesn't exist that you missed what was really happening right in front of you. Blackwood's composed facade cracked slightly. And what exactly is happening, Mr. Hawthorne? Justice. Will's eyes moved to the window again, noting positions, calculating angles. Not the kind that comes from court records or legal papers. You made sure of that when you burned the archives, the kind that comes from people finally seeing the truth. About Carson City, about you, about how many lives you've destroyed building your empire. Truth. Lancaster's laugh was harsh. Boy, I was there in Carson City. I know what happened. Do you? Will turned to face him fully. Know about the modified loads, about how the powder was measured to ensure maximum recoil, about how Blackwood's men switched the ammunition while you were playing to the crowd. His voice softened. Or did you? Just accept the glory of being the man who outshot James Hawthorne, never questioning why a champion shooter's gun would suddenly explode in his hands. Something flickered in Lancaster's eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or the first stirring of an unwelcome truth. His hand stayed near his gun, but the predatory certainty had left his stance. An interesting story, Blackwood cut in smoothly. But that's all it is. A story. Like this mysterious marshal with his non-existent evidence. Really, young man, I expected better from someone who showed such tactical creativity with Snake Eye Jackson. Jackson was a test, Will replied. A way to see how you'd respond, what kind of men you'd send. He played his part perfectly, trying to intimidate us with numbers, then trying to imitate Lancaster when that failed. Every move is predictable, every reaction exactly what I knew it would be, just like you knew I'd bring Lancaster here. Blackwood's smile was cold. Trying to create doubt, to turn my own men against me? No, sir. I knew you'd bring him because your ego demanded it. The great Victor Blackwood, arranging another exhibition shooting, another chance to demonstrate your power. Only this time, there won't be any tampered ammunition, no hidden schemes. Will's hand rested casually near his Winchester. Just the truth about Carson City, written in lead and smoke. Is that what this is about? Lancaster demanded. Another exhibition shoot? A chance to prove yourself against your father's legend? It's about choice, Mr. Lancaster. The choice you didn't have in Carson City because Blackwood didn't trust you to win fair and square. The choice you have now, to keep living a lie or to finally learn the truth about the day that made your reputation. The room had gone deadly still, every man present sensing the currents of power shifting like sand in a storm. Blackwood's pleasant mask had slipped completely, replaced by something harder, colder. Very dramatic, Mr. Hawthorne. But let me be clear, this ends one of two ways. Either you and your father sign over the ranch, or his hand moved slightly, and every gun in the room seemed to lift an inch. Or what? Will's voice carried that same quiet certainty it held when calculating an impossible shot. You'll have your men gun us down in broad daylight? Add our bodies to all the others you've buried building your empire? That might have worked in Carson City, might have worked in all the other places where people stood alone against your money and your guns. But look outside, Mr. Blackwood. Look at what's really happening in your carefully controlled town. Through the windows, the street was filled with people, ranchers, townspeople, cowboys, who looked remarkably well-armed for a casual visit to town. They moved with purpose, taking positions that Will had carefully planned over the past 3 days. Your men have the high ground, Will continued conversationally. The rooftops, the windows, all the best firing positions, exactly where you'd expect a man like you to put them, exactly where I wanted them to be. You think a few ranch hands and shopkeepers can stand against professional gunmen? Blackwood's voice dripped with contempt. I think you're so used to people being afraid that you've forgotten what happens when they stop fearing. When they realize that one man's greed isn't more powerful than an entire community's will to survive. Will's eyes met Lancaster's. Just like you've forgotten what it means to be a real exhibition shooter, to win fair and square, to build a reputation on skill instead of lies. Lancaster's face had gone pale, his eyes moving between Will and Blackwood with growing uncertainty. What are you saying, boy? I'm saying check your ammunition, Mr. Lancaster. Check it now, before history repeats itself, before you become just Another victim of Blackwood's schemes, another tool to be used and discarded when it served its purpose. The legendary gunman's hands moved to his gun belt, hesitated. "You're trying to play me, turn me against my employer." "No, sir. I'm giving you the choice you didn't have in Carson City. The choice to be the man you could have been, instead of the man Blackwood made you." The tension in the Promise City Hotel's dining room had reached a breaking point. Lancaster stood frozen, his hands hovering over his ammunition belt, pride warring with growing doubt in his eyes. Blackwood's carefully maintained facade had cracked completely, revealing the calculating predator beneath. And Will Hawthorne stood calmly. Between them, a living catalyst, forcing long-buried truths into the light. "Enough of this," Blackwood snapped, rising from his chair. "Lancaster, end this farce. Show this boy what happens to people who interfere with progress." But Lancaster didn't move. His fingers had found one of his cartridges, working it free. From his belt, with the careful precision of a man who'd spent his life understanding the relationship between powder and lead. "These aren't my usual loads," he said softly, almost to himself. "Weight's wrong, just like—" His head snapped up, eyes fixing on Blackwood with dawning comprehension. "Of course they're different," Blackwood's voice dripped condescension. "Special ammunition, just like in Carson City, to ensure a proper show." "To ensure the right outcome, you mean?" James Hawthorne's voice carried across the room, strong with years of suppressed truth. "Just like you ensured it before. Couldn't risk a fair contest, could you? Couldn't trust even your own chosen champion to win without your help." Will watched the interplay carefully, noting how the gathered gunmen shifted uneasily, reading the changing winds of loyalty and power. Outside, through the windows, he could see Elena Rodriguez moving purposefully between scattered groups of townspeople, passing quiet words that sent them drifting into carefully planned positions. "Don't listen to them, Luke," Blackwood commanded, but his voice had lost some of its authority. "They're trying to divide us, to weaken our position." "Our position?" Lancaster's laugh was bitter. "Like my position in Carson City. Tell me something, Victor. Did you ever believe I could beat James Hawthorne fair and square, or was I just another tool in your collection, another weapon to be aimed and fired?" "You're being dramatic." Blackwood tried to recover his smooth tone. "This boy has filled your head with fantasies." "No." Will's voice was quiet but carried to every corner of the room. "I've filled his head with mathematics, with the simple, unchangeable facts of powder loads and bullet weights. The kind of facts a real exhibition shooter would understand instantly if he bothered to check his ammunition before a show." He turned to Lancaster. "That's why my father always loaded his own rounds. Why did he taught me to do the same? Because some things can't be left to chance or to the kindness of men who see people as pieces on a board." Lancaster's hand moved to his gun, but instead of drawing, he began removing cartridges one by one, examining each with the expert eye of a man who'd built his life around understanding the science of shooting. With each shell inspected, his face grew darker. "All of them," he said finally, his voice heavy with realization. "Every single round, modified just enough to what? Make sure I don't miss my cue in your little drama." "Luke." Blackwood's voice held a warning note. "Think carefully about what you're doing." "I am thinking," Lancaster replied. "For the first time in years, I'm thinking clearly about Carson City, about how convenient it all was, the exhibition, the accident, the land deals that followed, about how many other accidents have happened since then, always benefiting you, always clearing the way for your empire." Will watched the legendary gunman's transformation with quiet satisfaction. This was the moment he'd been calculating since. That night with Jackson, not just trajectories of bullets, but trajectories of truth, each fact and revelation carefully aimed to hit its mark. "Your reputation was built on a lie, Mr. Lancaster," Will said softly, "but it doesn't have to stay that way." Sometimes the truest test of a man isn't in the shots he takes, but in the stands he makes when the truth finally comes clear. A commotion from the street drew everyone's attention. Sheriff Kane's voice carried through the windows. "Blackwood, your men are surrounded. We've got every approach covered, every escape route blocked. This ends here one way or another." Blackwood's composure shattered completely. "Surrounded by what? A handful of ranchers and shopkeepers? I have professional gunmen on every roof, in every window." "You have men who work for money," Will corrected, "standing against people fighting for their homes, their families, their future. And now they're about to learn something interesting about angles and trajectories." As if on cue, a shot rang out, one of Blackwood's rooftop gunmen taking aim at the gathering crowd below. But before he could fire again, a fusillade of return fire forced him to duck behind the parapet. Similar exchanges erupted across town, as Will's carefully positioned allies engaged Blackwood's men from unexpected angles. "You see," Will continued conversationally, as if discussing the weather rather than a developing gunfight, "when you control the high ground, you think you control the battle. But every elevated position has blind spots and has angles that can't be covered. My father taught me that, taught me to see not just where a shot comes from, but where it can't reach." Through the windows, Blackwood's men were discovering this truth the hard way. Every rooftop position, every sniper's perch he'd so carefully selected, was coming under fire from multiple directions. The professional gunmen found themselves pinned down by ranchers and townspeople who knew every quirk of their town's architecture, every shadow and corner that could provide cover. 3 days, Will explained to the increasingly pale Blackwood. 3 days to plan, to position people, to turn your tactical advantages into vulnerabilities. 3 days to show people that one man's greed doesn't have to define their future. Lancaster had moved away from Blackwood, his expression a mixture of disgust and dawning comprehension. The marshal with the evidence. That was never real, was it? This whole thing, this whole setup. "It was about choice," Will finished. "Your choice, right now, about whether you want to keep being Victor Blackwood's weapon or become your own man again. About whether you want your legacy to be built on lies or on the truth you choose at this moment." Outside, the gunfire was intensifying, but it was becoming clear that Blackwood's men were at a severe disadvantage. Cut off from each other, unable to support their positions without exposing themselves to fire from multiple angles, they were learning the hard way that sometimes the best tactical position was just another kind of trap. "It's over, Blackwood," James Hawthorne said, his damaged arm held close, but his voice strong. "Your empire stops here, in Promise City. Seems fitting somehow." Blackwood's hand darted toward his coat, reaching for a hidden derringer, but 3 guns tracked the movement. Will's Winchester, James's revolver, and most tellingly Lancaster's Colt. "Don't," Lancaster's voice was cold. "You've made me part of enough lies. Time for some truth." "Truth?" Blackwood's laugh was ugly. "The truth is I made you, Luke. Made your reputation, made you somebody. Without me, you're nothing but a second-rate trick shooter who couldn't beat James Hawthorne in a fair fight." "Maybe so," Lancaster acknowledged, "but better an honest second-rate than a champion built on lies." He turned to Will. "You knew, didn't you? Knew I'd check the ammunition if you pushed the right buttons. Knew I'd have to face the truth about Carson City. Knew you were a real exhibition shooter at heart," Will replied. "The kind who understands that true skill comes from honest practice, not rigged competitions. The kind who'd rather lose fair than win dirty." The street had gone oddly quiet, the gunfire dying down as Blackwood's men, one by one, found themselves facing the choice between surrender and destruction. Through the windows, Will could see them emerging from their positions, hands raised, facing a community united against the tyranny of one man's ambition. "So what now?" Blackwood demanded, his composure finally breaking completely. "You think this changes anything? I have connections, power, money." "Now," Will said quietly. You face justice, not just for Carson City, but for every ranch you've burned, every family you've destroyed, every life you've ruined building your empire. And you face it knowing that all your money, all your power couldn't stop one simple truth from coming to light. What truth is that? Blackwood spat. That some things can't be bought. Some things can only be earned through honest work and honest dealing. My father taught me that, along with everything else about shooting. And today, right now, everyone gets to see which lessons really matter. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of boots on the hotel's wooden porch. Sheriff Kane, entering with Frank Cooper and several deputies, their weapons ready but not aimed. It's done, Will, Marcus announced. Blackwood's men are surrendering all over town. Seems they lost their appetite for fighting when they realized they were facing the whole community instead of just a few ranchers. My men aren't cowards. Blackwood snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. No, Will agreed quietly. They're just men who finally understood the difference between fighting for money and fighting for home. Between following orders and following conscience. Lancaster had moved to the window, watching the scene unfold outside. Former gunmen were being disarmed by townspeople and ranchers, their fearsome reputations dissolving in the face of united resistance. You planned this, he said, turning back to Will. All of it. The confrontation with Jackson, the story about the marshal's evidence, the 3-day wait. It was all to give people time to decide where they really stood. People make better choices when they have time to think, Will replied. Time to remember who they were before men like Blackwood convinced them that money was more important than honor. Honor? Blackwood's laugh was harsh. You talk about honor while orchestrating an armed rebellion? While turning my own men against me with lies about Carson City? No lies, James spoke up, moving to stand beside his son. Just truth that's been buried too long. Truth about tampered ammunition, about planned accidents, about an empire built on corruption and fear. Truth that's about to spread far beyond Promise City, Sheriff Kane added. Telegraph operators been sending messages all morning, said to the territorial marshal, to every law enforcement office in 3 territories. Details about land grabs, about mysterious fires, about how the great Victor Blackwood built his fortune on burned homes and broken lives. Blackwood's face had gone pale. You can't prove any of that. Don't need to prove it all, Will said calmly. Just needed to give people a reason to start asking questions, to start looking closer at all those convenient accidents and mysterious fires. Once people stop being afraid, Mr. Blackwood, they start remembering all sorts of interesting details. Through the window, Elena Rodriguez could be seen organizing townspeople to provide water and food to those who'd helped defend Promise City. The sight of the community working together, supporting each other instead of cowering in fear, seemed to hit Blackwood harder than any bullet. You've ruined everything, he whispered, his carefully maintained facade crumbling completely. No, Lancaster corrected, checking his ammunition one more time before removing his gun belt entirely. You ruined everything the moment you decided that winning meant more than honor, that money meant more than the truth. He placed his guns on a nearby table. I rode for you because I thought I was something special, the man who outshot James Hawthorne. But I was just another one of your lies. What are you doing? Blackwood demanded as his legendary gunman stepped away from his weapons. Choosing truth over lies. Better to be remembered as the man who admitted his mistakes than the man who kept living them. Lancaster turned to James. I'm sorry about Carson City. I should have checked the loads, should have known something wasn't right. Pride and ambition made me blind. James nodded slowly. Pride and ambition make fools of us all. Sometimes it's what we do after we see the truth that matters. The morning sun had climbed higher, streaming through the windows to illuminate the hotel dining room, where so much had changed in so little time. Outside, Promise City was transforming, not just from a battlefield back to a town, but from A place ruled by fear to one shaped by community and courage. Sheriff, Will said quietly, I believe Mr. Blackwood has an appointment with justice that's been delayed far too long. As Marcus moved to take Blackwood into custody, the former empire, Builder made one last desperate play. You think this ends here? I have friends in high places, connections you can't imagine. Had friends, Cooper corrected. Telegraph's been busy this morning, remember? By now, every corrupt judge and bought politician in 3 territories is scrambling to distance themselves from you. Nobody wants to be connected to a man who's about to become famous for all the wrong reasons. Will watched as Blackwood was led away, seeing not the powerful empire builder who'd terrorized the territory, but just a man who'd forgotten that true strength comes from building things that last, not from destroying things that stand in your way. Lancaster lingered, looking uncertain for the first time since Will had known him. What happens now? Now? Will consider the question. Now you have a choice. The territorial marshal will want to talk to you about Carson City, about everything you know concerning Blackwood's operations. After that, he shrugged. After that, you get to decide what kind of man you want to be remembered as. Could use a good man to help teach at the new shooting school, James offered unexpectedly. At Will's surprised look, he smiled. Been thinking about it since Carson City. Territory needs a place where young shooters can learn the right way, about honor and responsibility, not just speed and accuracy. A chance to rebuild your reputation, Will added, this time on truth instead of lies. Lancaster looked between, father and son, seeing something he'd lost long ago, the chance to be part of something bigger than himself, something built on principles instead of greed. Think I'd like that, he said finally, if you're willing to have me. The sound of celebration was beginning to fill Promise City's streets as people emerged from their homes, realizing that the shadow that had hung over their valley was finally lifting. Will moved to the window, watching the community he'd helped. Defend, come together in victory and relief. Pa, he said quietly, remember what you taught me about trajectories, about how every shot affects everything it passes on its way to the target? I remember, James replied, coming to stand beside his son. Some trajectories take longer to reach their target than others. Some truths take time to find their mark. But in the end, he turned to Lancaster, in the end, every shot finds its home, one way or another. The morning sun caught the brass cartridges scattered across Promise City's streets, turning them to gold. Silent witnesses to the day, a community stood together. When one young man's gift for understanding trajectories helped change not just the path of bullets, but the course of justice itself. The sun was setting over Promise City, painting the sky in shades of gold and victory. The celebrations had died down to a quiet hum of satisfaction as people began the work of rebuilding, not just their town, but their sense of community. Will Hawthorne stood on the hotel's porch, watching as the last of Blackwood's men were led away under guard, their fearsome reputations dissolved in the face of united resistance. Territorial Marshal's men will be here by morning, Sheriff Kane reported, joining Will at the railing. Though I suspect most of Blackwood's so-called professionals will be long gone by then. Amazing how fast a man can ride when his pay source dries up. Not all of them, Will observed, nodding toward Lancaster, who was helping Eleanor and the other townspeople clear debris from the street. The legendary gunman worked with quiet determination, as if each piece of broken glass and splintered wood represented a lie he was finally putting right. Still not sure about him, Marcus admitted. Man built his whole reputation on a lie. Hard to come back from something like that. Depends on what you're coming back to, James Hawthorne said, emerging from the hotel. His damaged arm was still held close, but he stood straighter now, as if a great weight had finally lifted. Sometimes a man needs to lose everything he thought he was to become what he should have been all along. The words seemed to catch Lancaster's attention. He set down the broken chair he'd been carrying and approached the porch. His movements, carrying none of the gunfighter's swagger he'd worn like armor just hours before. "Been thinking about what you said," he addressed James, "about the shooting school, about teaching things right this time." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But why offer that chance to me? After everything that happened in Carson City?" "Because sometimes the best teacher is someone who's learned the hard way," Will answered before his father could. "Someone who understands the difference between showing off and showing the way." Frank Cooper rode up, his horse's hooves raising small. Clouds of dust in the golden evening light. "Just got back from the telegraph office," he reported, words spreading faster than a prairie fire, Blackwood's empires falling apart, partners turning evidence, politicians denying connections, bankers suddenly discovering irregularities in his accounts. "Amazing how quick rats leave a sinking ship," Marcus observed dryly. "More amazing how quick people find their courage once they see others standing up," Will countered. He turned to Cooper. "What about the burned records, the deeds and titles Blackwood tried to destroy?" A smile broke across the rancher's weathered face. "Funny thing about that. Seems Maria Ortiz had been making copies of every important document, filed in that archive for years. Kept them in a strongbox under her store counter, said she never trusted how convenient those fires were, happening just when someone refused to sell to Blackwood." James laughed softly. Always knew that woman. Was smarter than she let on, keeping records of her own just in case. "Just in case someone came along who wasn't afraid to use them," Maria herself said, approaching with a large leather ledger in her arms. "Everything's here, every deed, every sale, every transaction that seemed just a little too convenient. Been waiting for the right moment, the right person to stand up first. We'll study the shopkeeper with new respect. You've been planning this as long as we have." "Longer," Maria corrected. "Since Carson City, since we all watched a good man get broken by greed and lies." She turned to James. "No offense meant." "None taken," James replied. "Some things have to break before they can be rebuilt stronger." The evening breeze carried the smell of Elena's cooking from the cafe. She'd insisted on preparing a proper meal for everyone who'd helped defend the town. The aroma mixed with wood smoke and gunpowder, creating a scent that seemed to mark the end of one era and the beginning of another. "Young Miguel's been asking about the shooting school," Lancaster mentioned, almost hesitantly. "Boys have natural eyes from what I've seen. Might be good to teach him right from the start, instead of letting him learn bad habits." "Might be good to teach a lot of things right from the start," Will agreed. "About more than just shooting. About responsibility, about community, about standing up for what's right, even when standing alone." "Never really alone," Elena called from across the street. "Not when you give people reason to believe in something bigger than fear." The truth of her words was evident in the scene before them. People who'd spent years avoiding each other's eyes, afraid of drawing Blackwood's attention, now worked together with easy familiarity. Ranchers and townspeople, cowboys and shopkeepers, all united by the simple act of one young man refusing to back down. "You knew," Lancaster said suddenly, turning to Will. "Knew I'd check the ammunition, knew it would lead to all of this. Planned it down to the last detail, didn't you?" "Not everything," Will admitted. "Couldn't know for sure how people would choose when the moment came. But I knew enough about angles and trajectories to understand that sometimes the straightest path isn't the best one. Sometimes you have to let truth find its own way to its target." James placed his good hand on his son's shoulder. "Your mother would be proud, boy, not just of your shooting, but of how you used what I taught you. Took my lessons about trajectories and applied them to something bigger than just putting lead on target." "Speaking of targets," Marcus interjected, "what happens now? Blackwood's finished, his empire's crumbling, but there'll be others. Men who think money and guns can buy anything they want. Now we build something stronger than one man's greed, Will replied. Something built on community instead of fear, on truth instead of lies. He gestured to the gathering darkness. Look around. Every person here stood up when it mattered. Every person here proved that some things can't be bought. Lancaster nodded slowly. Like the shooting school, teaching young ones the right way from the start so they understand that skill without honor is just another kind of weapon. More than that, James added. Teaching them that every shot has consequences, every action affects more than just its immediate target. The kind of lessons that might have changed everything in Carson City if we'd understood them sooner. The last light of day caught the brass cartridges still scattered across Promise City's streets, turning them to gold, not just spent ammunition now, but markers of a moment when a community found its courage, when truth finally found its target after years of waiting. Pa, Will said quietly, remember what you used to say about exhibition shooting? About how the real trick isn't hitting the target, but knowing which target to aim for? Remember a lot of things I used to say. James smiled. Some of them might even have been worth listening to. Worth building on, Will corrected. It's worth taking what you taught me about angles and trajectories and using it to help others find their own way to stand up, to make their own choices. About what kind of future they want to build. The evening had deepened to true night now, stars appearing one by one above Promise City like distant watchers bearing witness to the change below. In the cafe, Elena was gathering people for supper, her voice carrying clearly in the cooling air. The simple domesticity of the moment seemed to underscore everything they'd fought for, not just the right to own land or run cattle, but the right to build a community worth protecting. You know, Lancaster said thoughtfully, back in Carson City, before everything, I used to dream about being famous, about being the man who could outshoot anyone. It took me all these years to realize that some kinds of fame are just another kind of prison. Not too late to build a different kind of reputation, Will offered. One based on what you give back instead of what you take away. The former gunman considered this, looking around at the town he'd entered as an enemy and might now help rebuild as a friend. Might take some time, he admitted. Got a lot to make up for. Time's what we've got now, James assured him. Time to build something real, something that can't be bought or burned away, something worth more than all Blackwood's gold. As if to punctuate his words, Elena's dinner bell rang out across Promise City, calling people to share food and fellowship. Will watched as the community gathered, seeing not just the end of one story, but the beginning of many others. Stories about choice and consequence, about truth and redemption, about the kind of courage that comes not from the gun in your hand, but from the principles in your heart. The night wind carried the sound of distant hoofbeats, probably the last of Blackwood's men fleeing into darkness, carrying word of how one young man's gift for understanding trajectories had helped change not just the path of bullets, but the course of justice itself. Inside Elena's cafe, the celebration had taken on a quieter, more thoughtful tone. People gathered around tables, sharing not just food but stories. Tales of resistance long hidden, of small defiances that had waited for this moment to be revealed. Had 3 of Blackwood's men come into my store last month, old Pete Wilson was saying, his buffalo gun propped carefully in the corner. Trying to pressure me into selling. Told them the place wasn't worth much, just a simple shop. He grinned. Didn't mention the cellar full of ammunition I'd been collecting, just in case someone ever had the courage to stand up. Same at my place, Maria added. Kept copies of those records, but also kept track of which of Blackwood's men came around, what they said, who they threatened. Everything went in the ledger. All of you, Will realized, looking around the room. All this time, you were all preparing, just waiting for the right moment. Waiting for someone to show us it was possible, Elena corrected, setting down another plate of food. Someone to prove that one person standing up could give others the courage to stand too. Through the cafe's windows, Promise City looked different now. The damage from the morning's conflict was still visible, but people were already working together to repair it, to rebuild not just buildings but the bonds between neighbors that fear had frayed. "You know what really made the difference?" Lancaster spoke up unexpectedly. He'd been quiet through most of the meal, listening, observing. Wasn't just the shooting impressive as that was. It was understanding people, reading them like you read trajectories, seeing where they'd go before they knew themselves. James nodded. That was always the real lesson, though I didn't know I was teaching it. Wasn't just about calculating angles and distances, was about understanding how everything connects, how one action leads to another. Like how checking those cartridges led to all of this, Lancaster agreed, touching his now empty gun belt. Never would have thought a simple thing like powder weight could bring down an empire. Truth's funny that way, Sheriff Kane observed. Sometimes the smallest detail, the tiniest bit of evidence, can unravel the biggest lie. Just needs someone patient enough to follow the thread. Will listened to the conversations flowing around him, seeing how each person's story connected to the others, how the community was weaving itself back together through shared experience and newfound trust. Young Miguel Martinez appeared at his elbow, eyes bright with excitement. "Mr. Hawthorne, is it true what they're saying about the shooting school?" "It's true," Will confirmed, "though it'll be about more than just shooting. Right, Pa?" James straightened in his chair. "That's right. Be about responsibility, about understanding that every skill comes with obligations, about making sure what happened in Carson City never happens again. And about choices," Lancaster added, surprising everyone. "About understanding that it's never too late to choose a different path." He looked at Miguel. "Even old dogs like me can learn new tricks if they're taught right." Frank Cooper, who'd been studying the town's layout through the window, turned back to the group. "I'm going to need to make some changes if we're serious about the school. Proper ranges, safety measures. Can't have students practicing in the middle of town." "Already thought about that," Will replied. "Remember that old Watson place out by Eagles Ridge? Good sight lines, plenty of room, and far enough from town to be safe, but close enough to be practical." "Watson's place?" Cooper looked thoughtful. "That's been empty since Blackwood's men paid him a visit last year." "Not empty anymore," Maria interjected. "According to these records, Watson never sold. Place is still legally his, and his daughter's been living over in Silver Creek. Bet she'd be interested in seeing it put to good use." The planning continued as the evening deepened, people contributing ideas, offering resources, volunteering help. What had started as a desperate stand against tyranny was transforming into something more. A community redesigning itself around principles of justice and mutual support. "You know," Lancaster said quietly to Will, "back in my exhibition days, I used to think the crowd's applause was all that mattered. The admiration, the reputation. Never understood there could be something more satisfying than being the fastest. A gun. And now I'm thinking maybe teaching someone to shoot straight, really straight, with their heart as well as their hands, might be worth more than all the exhibition trophies in the world." The night had grown late, but no one seemed eager to leave. This gathering had become something more than a celebration of victory. It was a moment of transformation, of people realizing that the strength they'd found together was something worth preserving. Sheriff Kane, making his rounds one last time before turning in, paused at their table. "Just got word from the telegraph office. News of what happened here is spreading fast. Other communities are starting to ask questions, stand up to men like Blackwood. Seems your trajectory calculations affected more than just Promise City. Will, every shot has a wider impact than its immediate target." Will quoted his father's teachings. "Every action sends ripples we might not see until later." James smiled. "Some lessons turn out to mean more than we intended when we taught them." Outside, the night was full of stars. each one a bright point in the vastness, like the scattered brass cartridges that had marked the day's turning points. Will stepped onto the cafe's porch, breathing in the cool air, feeling the weight of what had been accomplished and the promise of what was yet to come. Elena followed him out, bringing a fresh cup of coffee. You know, when all this started, people thought you were just trying to save your ranch, but it was never just about that, was it? No, Will agreed, accepting the coffee. It was about proving that some things can't be bought or bullied away, that a community standing together is stronger than any one man's greed. And about second chances, Lancaster added, joining them on the porch. About proving that even old guns can learn new tricks if they're willing to admit their mistakes and try again. The three of them stood in comfortable silence, watching. Promise City settle into its first peaceful night in years. Tomorrow would bring the territorial marshal, official investigations, the formal dismantling of Blackwood's empire. But tonight was for something more personal. For a community rediscovering its soul, for people remembering that courage, like any skill, grows stronger with practice. Pa once told me, Will said softly, that the real mark of a shooter isn't in how many targets he hits, but in knowing which targets are worth aiming for. Took me a while to understand he wasn't just talking about shooting. The night wind carried the distant howl of a coyote, a lonely sound that seemed to mark the end of one era and the beginning of another. Promise City had lived up to its name, at last becoming a symbol of what people could achieve when they chose hope over fear, truth over lies, community over greed. And somewhere in the darkness, the last echoes of gunfire were fading, replaced by the stronger, steadier sounds of a future being built on foundations too solid to shake, too true to deny, too deeply rooted in justice to ever be bought or sold. Weeks that followed, Promise City's stand against Blackwood's empire brought changes that rippled through the territory like waves from a stone cast in still water. Summer had given way to early autumn, painting Rattlesnake Valley in golds and reds that seemed to mirror the brass cartridges still occasionally found in Promise City's streets. Silent reminders of the day a community found its courage. The Hawthorne Ranch had transformed. What had once been a quiet cattle operation now bustled with activity as the shooting school took shape. The old barn had been converted into a classroom, its walls lined with diagrams showing angles and trajectories. Outside, proper ranges had been set up, each one designed to teach different aspects of responsible marksmanship. Will Hawthorne stood on the porch of the main house, watching as Lancaster worked with young Miguel Martinez and 3 other students. The former exhibition shooter had found his true calling in teaching, his own hard-learned lessons about pride and responsibility, adding weight to his instructions. Remember, Lancaster was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air, it's not about being the fastest or the most impressive. It's about understanding the responsibility that comes with the skill. Every shot has consequences beyond its target. Just like in Promise City, Miguel responded eagerly. How one person standing up gave others the courage to stand too. Will smiled at the boy's enthusiasm. The story of Promise City's resistance had already become legend throughout the territory, though Will suspected the telling grew more elaborate with each retelling. Some claimed he'd outshot 20 of Blackwood's men in the dark. Others swore he could calculate bullet trajectories in his head faster than most men could draw. Quite a change, James observed, joining his son on the porch. The older man moved. Easier these days, his damaged arm still limited, but his spirit stronger than it had been since Carson City. Never thought I'd see Luke Lancaster teaching kids about responsibility. People can surprise you, Will replied, when you give them the chance to be better than their past. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Sheriff Kane rode up with Frank Cooper and Maria Ortiz, their expressions suggesting news of importance. Word from the territorial marshal, Marcus announced as they dismounted. Blackwood's trial is set for next month. They've got enough evidence to put him away for a long time. Land fraud, attempted murder, conspiracy. Seems once people stopped being afraid, they couldn't wait to testify. And not just here, Cooper added. Similar stories coming in from all over, ranchers standing up to land grabbers, communities uniting against corrupt officials. What happened in Promise City lit a fire that's still spreading. Maria produced a newspaper from her saddlebag. They're calling it the Promise City Revolution, not for the gunfire, but for how it proved that ordinary people standing together can overcome even the most entrenched corruption. Will took the paper, noting how the story emphasized not just the confrontation, but the way the community had united, how people had chosen truth over fear, cooperation over submission. Revolution seems like a big word for people simply choosing to do what's right, he observed. Sometimes that's the biggest revolution of all, James said softly. When people remember, they have the choice. The morning lesson had ended, and Lancaster approached the porch, his students dispersing to practice what they'd learned. The former gunman moved differently now, the predatory swagger replaced by something more measured, more purposeful. Young Miguel's got a natural talent, he reported. But more importantly, he's got the right mindset. I want to learn for the right reasons. And what are the right reasons? Maria asked, though her smile suggested she already knew the answer. To protect, not to prove anything. To stand up for what's right, not to show off. Lancaster's eyes met Will's. Took me too many years to learn that lesson. Might have saved a lot of trouble if someone had taught me sooner. The conversation was interrupted by Elena Rodriguez, arriving in her wagon, bringing lunch for the students and news from town. You'll never guess who came into the cafe this morning, she called out as she climbed down. Thomas Watson's daughter, come to see about that land offer. This was significant news. The Watson property, adjacent to the Hawthorne Ranch, was ideal for expanding the shooting school. But more than that, it represented another piece of Blackwood's empire being reclaimed, another wrong being set right. What did she say? Will asked. Says she likes the idea of her father's land being used to teach people to stand up for themselves. Eleanor's smile was bright. I want to be part of building something good out of all the bad that happened. The morning had warmed considerably, but the autumn air held a crispness that seemed to sharpen every detail. The sound of practice shots from the range, the distant lowing of cattle, the steady rhythm of construction as more training facilities took shape. You know, Cooper observed, when you first started planning this school, I thought it was just about teaching shooting. But it's more than that, isn't it? Will nodded, watching as Miguel helped his younger sister adjust her stance. With the patience he'd learned from Lancaster. It's about teaching people they have choices. That standing up doesn't always mean drawing a gun. Sometimes it means standing together, speaking truth, choosing right over easy. Like how you chose to give Lancaster a chance, Marcus noted. Could have ended differently that day in Promise City. Everything could have ended differently, Will acknowledged, if people had chosen fear over courage, lies over truth. If they'd believed they were alone instead of part of something larger. James watched his former rival working with the students, seeing not the man who'd been part of his downfall in Carson City, but someone seeking redemption through honest service. Sometimes the hardest shot, the elder Hawthorne mused, is the one that requires you to hold your fire, to wait for the right moment, the right reason. Speaking of right moments, Maria interjected, the territorial marshal wants to know if you'll consider training his deputies. Says if Promise City proved anything, it's that law enforcement needs to be about more than just being quick on the draw. Will considered this, seeing how each decision, each action, continued to create ripples that affected more lives than he could have anticipated. Might be worth discussing. If we're serious about changing things, it needs to happen at every level. The sound of more riders approaching turned their attention back to the road. A group of ranchers from the North Range had arrived, leading pack horses loaded with supplies. their contribution to the school's construction. Among them rode Sarah Peterson, whose father's ranch had been one of Blackwood's first targets. "Brought lumber and nails," she announced, "and some stories you might want to hear about other places where people are starting to stand up, to remember they're stronger together than alone." As the newcomers integrated into the morning's activities, Will was struck by how naturally people worked together now, how the barriers of fear and suspicion that Blackwood had cultivated had crumbled in the face of shared purpose. "You know, what's really changing?" Eleanor asked softly, as if reading his thoughts. "It's not just that people aren't afraid anymore. It's that they're remembering how to hope, how to build something, instead of just surviving." Lancaster had resumed his instruction, but now his words carried a deeper resonance. "Every shot has a trajectory," he was telling his students. "But it's not just about the bullet's path. It's about understanding how your actions affect everything they touch, how one person's choice can change the course of many lives." The morning sun had climbed higher, burning away the last traces of dawn mist from Rattlesnake Valley. From the porch of what had once been just a rancher's home, but was now becoming something more, Will Hawthorne watched the future taking shape, not just in the construction of new buildings or the sound of practice shots, but in the way people moved with newfound purpose, newfound pride. "Pa," he said quietly, "remember what you used to say about exhibition shooting, about how the real trick was making something difficult look simple?" James nodded, understanding where his son was leading. "And sometimes the most difficult thing is just showing people they had the strength inside them all along." The wind carried the sound of Lancaster's voice, teaching not just marksmanship now, but the principles that could have changed everything in Carson City, about honor, about choice, about the responsibility that comes with any skill. Each word was another shot finding its mark, another trajectory calculated not to destroy, but to build. And somewhere in the territory, other communities were finding their own courage, their own ways to stand together against corruption and greed. The story of Promise City had become more than just a tale of one young man's skill with a rifle. It had become a reminder that some things couldn't be bought, some principles couldn't be burned away, some truths would always find their target in the hearts of those ready to stand up for what was right. "Got another letter from Silver Creek," Sheriff Kane announced, pulling a worn envelope from his vest. "Their town council's asking about setting up their own school, based on what we're doing here. Says they've got 3 families willing to donate land." Will wasn't surprised. In the weeks since Promise City's stand, similar requests had come from across the territory. What had started as one ranch's resistance had grown into something larger, a movement built not on violence, but on the principles of community and mutual support that had helped them overcome Blackwood's empire. "Might be worth considering," James mused. "Not just teaching shooting, but teaching what we learned here, about standing together, about choosing right over easy." "Already ahead of you, Pa." Will gestured to where Lancaster worked with his students. "Been thinking about how to turn what happened here into something that can help other communities. Not just the shooting skills, but the deeper lessons." "About trajectories?" Eleanor asked with a knowing smile. "About how everything connects," Will corrected. "How one person standing up can give others courage. How a united community is stronger than any individual's greed. The kind of lessons that might have changed everything in Carson City if we'd understood them then. The sound of hammering from the new construction mixed with the rhythmic report of practice shots, creating a symphony of progress and purpose." Sarah Peterson had organized the arriving ranchers into work crews, each focusing on a different aspect of the school's expansion. "You know what's really different?" Maria observed, watching the activity. "It's not just that people are working together, it's how they're planning for the future. Last month, most folks were just trying to survive Blackwood's pressure. Now they're building something larger than themselves. Building on what you started, Marcus added. This school, these lessons, they're not just about shooting anymore. They're about proving that ordinary people can stand up to corruption if they stand together. Lancaster had finished his morning lesson and approached the porch, his face thoughtful. "Been thinking about Carson City," he said quietly. "About how different things might have been if I'd understood then what I'm teaching these kids now. About honor, about choices. Can't change the past," James replied, but his voice held no bitterness. "Can only build something better from its lessons." The autumn wind carried the sound of approaching wagons, more families arriving for the afternoon sessions. The school had quickly outgrown its initial scope, becoming not just a place to learn marksmanship, but a center for the kind of community building that had helped them overcome Blackwood's influence. Young Teresa Martinez asked an interesting question this morning, Lancaster reported. Wanted to know if the angles and trajectories we're teaching apply to more than just bullets. Got me thinking about how what happened here is spreading. How each action creates ripples we might not see at first. Will nodded, understanding. Like how standing up to Jackson led to people questioning Blackwood's power. How one moment of resistance gave others the courage to resist too. Every action has its own trajectory, its own path to something larger. Speaking of larger things, Cooper interjected, the Territorial Governor's Office sent a representative yesterday. They're looking at using Promise City as a model for community, organization, how people can work together to prevent the kind of corruption Blackwood represented. They're a bit late to that particular lesson, Maria observed dryly. Communities across the territory are already doing it, setting up their own watches, sharing information, standing together against land grabbers and corrupt officials. Elena had been quiet, watching the activity around the ranch with thoughtful eyes. "You know what really changed?" she finally asked. "It's not just that Blackwood's gone, or that his empire's fallen. It's what people remember now. Remember what they can accomplish when they stop being afraid and start working together." The truth of her words was evident in every aspect of the scene before them. The shooting ranges were full of students learning not just accuracy, but responsibility. The new buildings rising showed the community's commitment to building something lasting. Even the way people moved and spoke carried a new confidence, a certainty that came from knowing they were part of something larger than themselves. "Got a telegram from the Territorial Marshal this morning," Marcus added. "Blackwood's trial date's been moved up. Seems more witnesses keep coming forward, people who were afraid to speak before. Each one with their own story about land grabs, about threats, about fires that weren't accidents. And Lancaster's testimony about Carson City will seal it," James noted. "Truth has a way of finding its mark, even years later." Will watched as Miguel helped a younger student adjust their stance, showing the same patience and care that Lancaster had shown him. The boy who had wanted revenge had found something better, a way to help others stand up for themselves, to build instead of destroy. "You know what Pa always said about the hardest shot?" Will asked the gathered group. "It's not the long-distance ones or the trick shots that look impressive. It's the shot you don't take. The moment you choose a different path, a better way to solve the problem. Like choosing to give me a chance," Lancaster acknowledged. "Could have called me out in Promise City, demanded revenge for Carson City. Instead, you showed me a truth I'd been running from for years." The sun had reached its zenith, casting sharp shadows across the ranch yard. In those shadows, Will could almost see the ghosts of what might have been. The hatred that could have grown from Carson City, the violence that could have consumed Promise City. But those shadows were being replaced by something brighter, something built on understanding and hope instead of fear and revenge. "Sometimes," James said softly, "the truest aim isn't about where the bullet goes, but about where it leads others to go. About the paths it opens up, the changes it makes possible. A young girl's delighted laugh rang out from the practice range. She'd hit her target for the first time. The sound seemed to embody everything they'd fought for, everything they were building now. Not just a school, not just a community, but a future where standing up for what's right was as natural as breathing. And somewhere in that future, other communities would find their own ways to stand together, to build something stronger than fear or greed. The story of Promise City would be told not just as a tale of resistance, but as a reminder that the truest revolution starts in the heart, where courage meets conviction, where one person's stand can change the course of countless lives. Up. Next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.